He had $11 left in his wallet, an eviction notice folded in his back pocket, and a 6-year-old girl holding his hand asking if they could get ice cream. Mason Reed looked down at his daughter's face, those wide brown eyes that still believed her dad could fix anything, and he lied through his teeth. "Maybe on the way home, Bug." But there was no ice cream money. There was barely gas money. And then, on a quiet park trail that Saturday afternoon, he saw a woman in a wheelchair, completely alone, completely stuck. And everything changed. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now sit back, because this one's going to take a while. And it's worth every minute. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday. Mason Reed had read it standing at the mailbox in his driveway, grease still under his fingernails from the transmission job he'd just finished. A job that paid him $140, which was $60 less than what the customer originally agreed to, because the guy had stood there with his arms crossed and said the work took too long, and Mason, too tired to argue, too behind on everything to risk losing the payment entirely, had just nodded and taken the cash. $140. The notice said he owed $920 in back rent. He'd stood there in the driveway for a long time, the paper in his hand, the afternoon sun cutting hard across the concrete. His garage, Reed's Auto and Repair, a name he'd painted himself on a piece of plywood that hung above the bay doors, sat just beside the house, a small cinder block building that smelled permanently of motor oil and old rubber. It had been his father's shop once. His father had run it for 22 years before his knees gave out and his heart followed 18 months later. Mason had taken it over at 28, fresh from a divorce he hadn't seen coming, with a 4-year-old daughter and a toolbox and exactly zero plan beyond getting through the next week. That was 2 years ago. Getting through the next week had become a lifestyle. He'd folded the notice and put it in his back pocket and gone inside to start dinner. That was Tuesday. By Saturday, he still hadn't figured out what to do about it. He'd called his landlord, Dennis Farrow, a heavy-set man in his 60s who owned 3 rental properties in Clover Falls, and talked about the market the way other people talked about the weather, like it was something happening to him personally. Dennis had been sympathetic in the particular way that meant he wasn't actually sympathetic at all. "Mason, I like you. I really do. But I got a mortgage on that property too. I can't keep floating you month to month. You understand." "I just need 2 more weeks, Dennis." "That's what you said last time." "Last time I needed 1 week and I got you the money. 2 weeks late. But I got it to you." There had been a pause. Mason could hear a television in the background on Dennis's end, a sports broadcast. Someone had scored something. 2 weeks, Dennis finally said. "But Mason, I mean it this time. I got a nephew who wants to rent that space for his landscaping equipment. Good, steady income. I'm not trying to be the bad guy here, but—" "I know," Mason said. 2 weeks. "Thank you." He'd hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hand still on the phone, doing the math in his head for the 14th time that week. The math kept coming out the same way it always did. Wrong. He had 2 cars in the shop, one waiting on a part that had been back-ordered for 6 days, one that the owner kept delaying pickup on. He had 3 oil change appointments booked for the following week, which would bring in maybe $250 if everyone actually showed. He owed his parts supplier $430 on a net 30 account that was now at 47 days. He had a credit card with a $600 limit and $571 already on it. And he had Lily, who was 6 and gap-toothed and completely certain that her father was the smartest man alive because he could name every part of an engine and also do a pretty good dinosaur impression. Lily, who had lost a shoe somewhere in the past week and had been wearing mismatched footwear to school with a cheerfulness that broke Mason's heart a little every morning. Lily, who had asked him twice that week if they were poor, and both times Mason had said, "We're working on it, Bug," and she had accepted this answer with a trust that he was not sure he deserved. He'd decided that morning that Lily needed a normal Saturday. Not a Saturday where Dad stared at the computer screen trying to find a business loan he wasn't going to qualify for. Not a Saturday where the garage bay doors stayed open until 7 and Lily sat on an overturned bucket doing her coloring pages while Mason worked. A real Saturday, the kind a 6-year-old was supposed to have. Clover Falls had a public park called Riverside Green that ran along the eastern edge of town, following the bend of the Alcott River. It had walking trails, a small playground, some open grass fields, and a duck pond that Lily had strong opinions about. It was free. It was 20 minutes from their house. Mason packed a water bottle and some crackers in a backpack and told Lily they were going on an adventure. She wore her mismatched shoes and did not care even a little. They arrived at Riverside Green just after noon. It was one of those September Saturdays that couldn't quite decide what season it wanted to be. Warm enough in the sun to roll up your sleeves, cool enough in the shade to make you glad you'd brought a jacket. The trees along the trail were just beginning to turn, a few early reds and oranges scattered through the mostly still green canopy, the whole effect like someone had started decorating and then gotten distracted. Lily immediately wanted to go to the duck pond. The duck pond was a short walk from the main parking area, down one of the paved accessible trails that looped through the eastern section of the park. Mason had been here enough times to know the layout. The trail was well-maintained, relatively flat, popular on weekends with joggers and families, and the occasional elderly couple walking at the speed of a considered thought. Lily had brought a small sandwich bag of crackers specifically for the ducks, a plan she'd announced at breakfast with the gravity of someone presenting a quarterly report. She held the bag in both hands as they walked, taking the responsibility seriously. "Are the ducks going to remember me?" she asked. "From last time?" "Yeah, do ducks remember people?" Mason thought about this. "I think they remember people who bring food." She considered this. "So they remember me as the cracker girl?" "Probably." "That's a good thing to be remembered as." "I think so too." They'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Mason heard it, a sharp metallic sound, like something catching and then releasing. Not a bird, not a jogger, something mechanical. He turned his head automatically, the way he always did when he heard something mechanical, because his brain had been trained for 15 years to pay attention to sounds that didn't belong. He saw her about 40 yards ahead, where the trail curved around a stand of oak trees. She was in a power wheelchair, a serious piece of equipment, not the basic hospital kind, but a high-end custom unit with a narrow profile and what looked like precision-engineered components on the wheel assembly. Or at least it had looked like that at some point. Right now, the chair had stopped in the middle of the trail, listing slightly to the left, and the woman in it was looking down at the left rear wheel with an expression that had moved past frustrated and arrived somewhere closer to carefully controlled alarm. She was young, maybe late 20s, early 30s, dark hair pulled back with pieces escaping around her face. She wore a light gray blazer over a plain white shirt, which seemed like an unusual choice for a Saturday at a public park, but was not Mason's business. She had a phone in her hand and was looking at it, then looking at the wheel, then looking back at her phone with the expression of someone who had already made 3 calls that weren't going the direction she needed. The trail was busy enough. He counted 4 joggers passing in the time it took him to observe all of this. 2 pairs, both moving in the opposite direction. A couple with a stroller had gone by without stopping. A man walking a dog had glanced over and kept going. Mason stopped walking. Lily stopped next to him. "What is it, Daddy?" "That lady looks like she might need help." Lily looked, assessed the situation with the analytical precision of a 6-year-old who had spent a lot of time in a repair garage. "Her chair's broken?" "Maybe." "We should help." He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with the expectation that this was obvious and they were wasting time discussing it. "Yeah," he said, "we should." He walked over at an angle that would be visible to her well before he arrived, not wanting to startle her by appearing suddenly from behind. When he got within a reasonable distance, he stopped and kept his voice easy. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you. Looks like you might be having some trouble. I'm a mechanic. Is there anything I can take a look at?" She looked up from her phone. Her eyes were dark, sharp, the kind that took a fast inventory of a situation. She looked at him, then at Lily, standing a few feet behind him holding her bag of cracker crumbs, then back at him. "The wheel locked," she said. "Left rear. It started making a noise about 10 minutes ago, and then it just stopped engaging correctly. The chair moves, but it pulls hard to the left, and the motor's cutting in and out." Her voice was calm and even, the way people were calm when they'd decided panic wasn't going to be useful. But he could see the tension in her jaw. The trail wasn't crowded enough to be dangerous, but she was effectively stranded. The chair could technically still move, but the description she'd given meant she probably couldn't navigate the uneven section of trail between here and the parking lot without significant risk of the wheel failing completely. "Okay," Mason said. "Do you mind if I crouch down and look at it? I won't touch anything without asking first." She paused, just a fraction of a second, then nodded. He crouched beside the left rear wheel assembly. Up close, the chair was even more impressive than it had looked from 40 yards. He could see the manufacturer's badge on the side panel, Sinclair Mobility Systems. He didn't know the brand, but the engineering was evident even to a quick look, or at least it had been designed to be impressive. The wheel assembly had a brushless hub motor with an integrated suspension unit, the kind of system that costs serious money. And right now, part of it was wrong. He leaned closer without touching. The wheel itself looked intact, no visible damage to the rim or tire. But there was something in the hub assembly that wasn't sitting right. He could see a slight misalignment where the motor housing met the suspension bracket, and there was a faint discoloration on the lower edge of the housing, the kind of heat staining you got when metal-on-metal friction had been happening somewhere it wasn't supposed to. "There's something going on in the hub assembly," he said. "Can I ask how long you've had the chair?" "About 8 months. Have you noticed any noise from this wheel before today? Like a intermittent clicking? Or maybe a slight vibration when you're on uneven ground?" She went quiet for a moment. "There was a clicking sound occasionally. I mentioned it to the service contractor and they said it was normal settling for a new unit." Mason said nothing to that. He looked at the housing again. The discoloration pattern told him the friction had been building for a while. This was not a sudden failure. "Do you have a manual release on this chair? Or a way to disengage the motor for this wheel?" "Yes. There's a lever on the back panel." "Okay. If you're comfortable with it, if I disengage the motor on that wheel, I might be able to get the housing to rotate enough to see what's actually going on in there. It won't damage anything further, but it's your chair, so your call." Another pause. She looked at him again with those sharp, assessing eyes. He realized he was still in his weekend clothes, a faded gray t-shirt with a small oil stain near the collar that he'd missed in the laundry, worn jeans, work boots. He probably looked like exactly what he was, which was a guy who worked with his hands and hadn't had a lot of reason recently to look like anything else. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mason Reed. I run a repair garage on Callaway Street, Mason's Auto and Repair." "And you're just here on a Saturday?" He gestured back toward Lily, who had found a spot on the grass a few feet off the trail and was examining something on the ground with serious scientific interest. "Duck pond trip. My daughter's conducting an investigation into whether ducks prefer whole crackers or broken ones." Something in the woman's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the tension in her jaw loosened by a degree or two. "The lever is on the left side of the back panel," she said. "There's a red handle." He moved to the back of the chair, found the lever, a clean, well-designed release mechanism. He disengaged it carefully, then returned to the wheel. With the motor disconnected from that wheel, he could manually rotate the housing. He did it slowly, watching the gap between the housing and the bracket. He got about 30 degrees of rotation before he felt it. A catch. Not dramatic, just a subtle resistance where there shouldn't be any resistance at all. He eased back the other direction, felt it again, found the spot. He held it there and looked. "I need a little more light," he said. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, angled it in. There. Inside the housing, where the motor mount connected to the suspension bracket, there was a small collar, a locking collar, the kind used to hold the assembly in precise alignment. And the collar was wrong. Not damaged, exactly. Not visibly cracked or broken. But it was the wrong specification. It was slightly undersized, which meant it had never been properly seated. Which meant that over the past 8 months of use and vibration and real-world conditions, it had been slowly working its way out of position. The heat staining confirmed it, metal shifting against metal, generating friction. Until today, the misalignment had reached the point where the motor's engagement was being disrupted. It was a small thing. It was such a small thing. A collar that was maybe 1.5 millimeters undersized. It had made this woman stranded on a trail in the middle of a public park. He sat back on his heels. "The motor mount collar in your hub assembly is the wrong size," he said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact. "It's undersized. It's been slowly losing its seating position since the chair was assembled. Today it shifted enough to create friction in the motor engagement. It's not going to get better on its own, and I'd be worried about trying to operate the chair normally until it's properly repaired. She was quiet for a moment. Can you fix it right now? Not properly. This needs a replacement collar, which is going to be a parts order. What I can do is, if you have something to temporarily reseat the collar and take the friction out of the engagement, you could get the chair to the parking lot safely. But it would be a temporary fix. A real repair needs the right part. Do you have anything like that? He thought. His truck was in the parking lot. He always kept a basic toolkit in the truck bed. Old habit, driven partly by professionalism and partly by the fact that he'd been stranded by his own vehicles enough times to learn a lesson about it. In the kit he had, among other things, a small assortment of shims and spacers that he kept for exactly the kind of improvised problem-solving that came with being a one-man shop. I might have something in my truck, he said. Give me 5 minutes. He jogged back to the parking lot. Lily, who had appeared at his side with the instinct of a child who knew when a parent was moving with purpose, jogged alongside him without being asked. Did you figure out what's wrong with her chair? She asked. I think so. Can you fix it? Temporarily. What does temporarily mean? It means good enough for now, needs a better fix later. She processed this. Like when you fix the refrigerator with the binder clip? Exactly like that. Is the binder clip still in the refrigerator? Yes. Mom always said... She stopped herself. She'd been doing that lately, starting sentences about her mother and then catching them midair and putting them back. Mason pretended not to notice, which felt like the wrong response every time, and he couldn't figure out what the right one was. What did Mom always say? He asked carefully. Lily shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 6-year-old performing nonchalance. Nothing. What does the thing look like that you need? He let it go for now, filing it in the back of his mind where he filed everything he didn't know how to handle yet. There was a lot in that file. It was getting crowded. He opened the truck's storage box, dug through the kit until he found what he was looking for, a small assortment of aluminum shims in varying thicknesses kept in a labeled plastic case. He pulled out the case and quickly sorted through the options. He needed something that would fill the gap created by the undersized collar. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to reduce the friction and restore reasonable function. He found 2 shims that would work together, pocketed them along with a flathead screwdriver and a small adjustable wrench. You're going back to fix it? Lily asked. Going to try. Can I come? Yeah, stay close and don't touch anything. I know, Dad. I've been in the garage. This was true. She had logged more hours in an auto repair garage than most adults. They walked back to the trail. The woman was still where he'd left her, though she'd shifted slightly, moved the chair a few inches to get further off the main path, to let the joggers pass without issue. She was watching them approach, and she watched Mason specifically with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, not quite wariness, more like she was figuring something out. Found what I needed, he said. I'm going to be honest with you. This is a shim improvisation, not a proper repair. It'll get the collar reseated well enough to reduce the friction and restore motor engagement. But you need to get this to a proper service center with the right replacement part as soon as possible, ideally today or tomorrow. I understand, she said. Please. He went back to the wheel. Working carefully, moving slowly, he used the flathead to ease the collar back toward its proper seating position. Then he fit the first shim into the gap, checked the alignment, added the second. Tightened the adjustment with the wrench. Not too much, just enough to hold the shims in place without creating new stress on the housing. He rotated the wheel manually. The catch was gone. Clean rotation all the way around. He re-engaged the motor release lever. Try it, he said, stepping back. She engaged the drive. The chair moved forward, straight, no pulling, no stuttering. She drove it forward 5 feet, then reversed, then turned. He watched the wheel the whole time. It held. That feels completely different, she said, and for the first time her voice had something in it that wasn't calibrated evenness. Just simple relief, raw and brief, but there. It should. But please don't wait on that repair. The shim will hold, but it's not rated for anything, and if the collar works loose again, You don't want to be somewhere more isolated than this. I won't wait. She turned the chair to face him. What do I owe you? He shook his head. Nothing. It was 20 minutes. For your time, for the materials. 2 aluminum shims I'm not going to use for anything else. Seriously, it's not. I'd like to pay you. I'd rather you didn't. He wasn't entirely sure why he was being stubborn about it. Some mix of habit and pride and the particular stubbornness of a man who spent a lot of time being paid less than he was worth and had decided that small acts of help should just be help. Just get the chair fixed, okay? That's what matters. She looked at him for a long moment. My name is Aurora Sinclair, she said. Mason Reed, he said again, because he wasn't sure if she'd retained it from the first time. I know. A pause. What garage did you say? Reed's Auto and Repair, on Callaway. But really, you need a mobility equipment service center, not an auto mechanic. I'll keep that in mind, she said. And then Lily, who had been standing very still and well-behaved for far longer than a 6-year-old could reasonably sustain, said, Excuse me. Both adults looked at her. Your wheelchair is really cool, she said to Aurora, with the directness of someone who had been saving this observation for the right moment. Does it have a motor? Aurora blinked. Then something happened in her face. A real change, not the controlled, calibrated adjustments she'd been making since they arrived. Something opened up. It does. 2, actually, 1 for each rear wheel. Lily's eyes went wide. 2 motors? 2 motors. My dad fixes motors, Lily said, as if this had not been amply demonstrated. He fixed ours on the refrigerator, and the lawnmower, and the truck 3 times. I heard, Aurora said. Her voice had gone quieter, gentler. She was looking at Lily with an expression Mason couldn't quite read. He seems very good at it. Lily nodded seriously. He's the best mechanic in Clover Falls. Mason opened his mouth to say something modest and deflecting. He is, Lily said again, as if the matter were settled. They watched Aurora navigate back toward the parking lot, the chair moving cleanly now. No hesitation, no pull. She turned once near the bend in the trail and gave them a small acknowledging nod, and then she was around the corner and gone. Lily looked up at Mason. She was nice. Yeah, he said. Is her chair going to be okay? If she gets the right repair, yeah. Are you worried? He thought about the collar, about the fact that it had been installed wrong from the start. Wrong specification, wrong fit, and someone along the way had signed off on it, or missed it, or decided it wasn't worth flagging. He thought about the service contractor who told her the clicking sound was normal settling. A little, he said honestly. Lily slipped her hand into his. Well, you fixed it for now. That's something. Yeah, he said. That's something. They went to the duck pond. Lily conducted her cracker experiment with scientific rigor and concluded, after extensive observation, that ducks had no strong preference between whole and broken crackers and were primarily motivated by volume and proximity. She reported these findings to Mason with the tone of a researcher presenting at a conference. He listened and watched her throw crackers and felt the eviction notice folded in his back pocket and thought, for a few minutes, about nothing except the ducks and his daughter and the particular golden quality of the afternoon light on the water. It was the best hour he'd had in weeks. They got home around 4:30. Mason made Lily a grilled cheese sandwich and put on a movie, and then, while she was occupied, went out to the garage and sat at his workbench with the shop's financial file open in front of him. He was good at this, at making himself go back to the numbers even when the numbers made him tired in a bone-level way. His father had always said that the worst thing a business owner could do was look away from the truth of it, even when the truth of it was bad. Especially when it's bad, his father had said. Because if you don't look at it, it doesn't get smaller, it just gets darker. So Mason looked at it. Parts supplier, $430 overdue. Rent, $920 overdue, 2-week extension, hard deadline. Credit card, $571 of $600. Back-ordered part for the Hendricks car, 6 days and counting, job on hold. Upcoming week income estimate, $250 if all 3 appointments held. Gap between money coming in and money needed, significant. He closed the file, opened it again, closed it again. He could call his cousin Brian in Pittsburgh, who had offered to loan him money 6 months ago, and Mason had said no because he didn't want to be that person, and he was still, obstinately, that person. He could try the small business loan application again, though the credit score situation wasn't going to be more favorable this week than it had been last month. He could call Dennis Farrow again and try to negotiate another extension, though Dennis had been fairly clear that he was out of patience. He could keep doing what he was doing, which was getting through the next week. And then the next one. He was very tired of getting through weeks. His phone rang at 6:17. He didn't recognize the number. Local area code, but not a contact. He almost didn't answer it. He had a policy about unknown calls after 5 p.m. because nothing good had ever come from one. He answered it. "Mr. Reed?" A woman's voice. Calm, even, controlled. He knew it immediately. The voice of someone who had spent an afternoon on a walking trail with a malfunctioning wheelchair and had stayed composed the whole time. "Miss Sinclair," he said. A brief pause. "I found your garage's number through the business directory. I hope this isn't an intrusion." "No," he said, straightening slightly without meaning to. "No, it's fine. I'm calling because I'd like to come by tomorrow morning, if that's possible. There's something I want to discuss with you professionally. Nothing alarming," she added, and he could hear a deliberate note of reassurance in it, like she'd anticipated the obvious anxiety of a small business owner getting a call from an unknown party. "I examined the wheel more closely after I got home, and your diagnosis was correct. In fact, I think the problem may be more significant than either of us realized on the trail. I'd like your eyes on a few things, at your professional rate." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I'm an auto mechanic," he said, "not a mobility equipment specialist." "I know what you are," Aurora Sinclair said. "And I know what I watched you do on that trail today. I'd still like your eyes on it tomorrow morning if you're available. I'll come to you." He looked around the garage, at the Hendricks car waiting on its back-ordered part, at the second bay currently empty, at the workbench with the financial files still sitting on it. "I'm available," he said. "Good." Another brief pause. "Tell your daughter the wheelchair has 3 software modes, by the way. One of them controls the maximum speed." She seemed like someone who would want to know that. He laughed, a short, surprise sound that he hadn't been planning on. "I'll tell her. She'll be thrilled. Good night, Mr. Reed." "Good night, Miss Sinclair." He hung up, sat still for a moment in the quiet of the garage, with the smell of oil and rubber and metal all around him, his workbench, his shop, his father's shop before his, the financial file sitting exactly where he'd left it. He didn't know what tomorrow's meeting would mean. He had no reason to think it would mean anything significant. People said, "I'll call you and let's connect professionally." And most of the time, it was exactly what it sounded like. A brief courtesy that dissolved in the ordinary forward motion of separate lives. But he thought about what she'd said. "I know what I watched you do on that trail today." He wasn't sure what she'd watched him do exactly. He'd crouched by a wheel in a public park for 20 minutes and improvised a repair with 2 aluminum shims and a wrench. He fixed things. That was all he did. That was the only thing he was consistently good at. He turned off the workbench light, locked the garage, went inside to check on Lily. She was asleep on the couch, one shoe off and one shoe on, appropriately mismatched to the end, the movie still running quietly to an empty audience. He turned it off, stood there in the dark living room, watching her breathe. He's the best mechanic in Clover Falls. The absolute conviction of it. No qualifier, no context, no awareness that this was a low bar she was setting, or possibly not even true. Just the simple, total certainty of a 6-year-old who believed what she believed. He picked her up carefully, trying not to wake her. She was heavier than she used to be. They all said that. Parents, about children, and he'd always thought it was a sentimental thing people said. But it was also just literally true. She was heavier. She was growing. Time was moving whether or not he could afford it. He carried her to her room and pulled the blanket over her and stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to bed. Tomorrow, Aurora Sinclair was coming to his garage. He had no idea, standing there in the dark hallway of his small house, with the eviction notice still in his back pocket and the financial file still open on the workbench, that tomorrow was the day the rest of his life decided to start showing up. Mason was up at 5:45, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he showered before going out to the garage and put on a shirt without any visible stains and spent approximately 4 minutes doing something with his hair that he couldn't fully justify to himself. He stood in the bathroom mirror afterward and looked at the result and decided it looked like a man who had tried slightly too hard, which was worse than a man who hadn't tried at all, so he ran a hand through it and went back to looking like himself. Lily was still asleep. He made coffee, drank half a cup standing at the kitchen window, watching the early light come up gray and soft over the back fence, then went out to the garage to make sure it was presentable. Presentable was a relative term. The garage was clean in the way a working garage was clean. Organized, functional, swept, but fundamentally a place where mechanical labor happened, and there was no disguising that. The floor had stains that were older than Lily. The shelving along the east wall held labeled bins of hardware and fluids and assorted components in a system that made complete sense to Mason and would have looked like controlled chaos to anyone else. The second bay was empty and clean. The Hendricks car sat in the first bay with its hood up, waiting on a part that remained, as of last night, still back-ordered. He moved a few things around without really improving anything, decided the garage was what it was, poured the rest of his coffee down the sink, and made a fresh pot. Aurora Sinclair arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes before the 9 o'clock she'd suggested. She came in a black SUV driven by someone else. Mason saw it pull up through the garage's side window and watched without trying to look like he was watching. The driver came around to the passenger side and opened a rear door, and Mason saw him remove and unfold a manual transport chair, different from the power unit from yesterday, lighter and more compact. Aurora transferred into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and did not need an audience's awareness of it. She was wearing different clothes than yesterday. Dark slacks, a simple navy top, a lightweight jacket. She had a leather messenger bag across her lap. She looked, Mason thought, like someone who was on her way to a meeting that she had already decided she was going to control. He went to the garage's side door and opened it before she reached it. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She came through the doorway and stopped just inside, and he watched her do the same quick inventory of the space that he'd seen her do on the trail the day before, the fast, systematic read of an environment. "Thank you for seeing me." "Coffee?" He said it before he'd fully decided to offer, then committed to it. "It's just a regular coffee maker, not anything impressive." "Black is fine." He got her a mug. She took it with both hands and drank without ceremony, and he appreciated that. He'd half expected someone who would decline politely or take a performative sip and set it aside. Instead, she drank about a third of it in the first go, like a person who actually needed coffee in the morning. "The wheel," she said, setting the mug on the edge of his workbench. She reached into her messenger bag and pulled out the left rear wheel assembly. She'd removed it from the chair entirely, which meant she'd either done it herself last night or had someone do it, but she'd had it done because she wanted to look at it. "I took it apart last night, as much as I could without specialized tooling." Mason looked at it. The housing was open. She'd gotten the outer cover off, which was not simple, and the interior components were visible. He could see the collar in question immediately, and he could also see what he hadn't been able to see yesterday on the trail, which was that the collar's failure had created secondary wear on the motor mount bracket itself. "You took this apart yourself?" he asked. "I had help." A pause that suggested the help had not been entirely willing or prepared for what the task involved. "I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I came here." He picked it up, turned it over, examined the bracket. The wear pattern there was telling, not the wear you got from a collar that had slipped once or recently, but the accumulated wear of months of small, repeated misalignment. 6, 8 months of it. Exactly the timeline she'd given him. "This bracket is going to need replacement, not just the collar," he said. "I know." Her voice was level. "But that's not the only reason I'm here." He put the assembly down on the workbench and looked at her. "Before I bought my company's current chair line," she said, "I used the previous generation. I've been using mobility equipment for 11 years. I know what normal wear sounds like, what normal settling feels like. When that clicking started 4 months ago, I knew it wasn't normal. She paused. The contractor who services our customer fleet told me it was fine. I had 2 different service technicians look at that specific wheel over the past 3 months. Both of them said the same thing. Normal for the unit, nothing to address. Mason waited. I went home yesterday afternoon, she said, and I pulled the service records for our full customer fleet. Every unit that's been in service for more than 6 months. She reached back into the messenger bag and pulled out a printed report, not a thin one. 31 units have logged complaints about noise or instability in the rear wheel assemblies. 14 of those units have had service calls. In 12 of those 14 cases, the service contractor marked the issue as normal operation and closed the ticket. Mason looked at the report she set on the workbench without picking it up yet. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice. Who manufactured the collar? He asked. We contract component sourcing to a third-party procurement firm. They source from multiple manufacturers depending on cost and availability. I don't know yet who made this specific collar or what specification it was ordered to, but I have someone pulling that information this morning. Her jaw tightened slightly. What I do know is that this wheel was assembled with a component that was either ordered to the wrong specification or sourced from a vendor who didn't meet the specification they were given. And I know that multiple service contractors looked directly at the result of that mistake and called it nothing. Mason picked up the report, scanned the first 2 pages. The complaint descriptions were consistent: clicking, instability, motor hesitation, pulling to one side. In several cases, users had reported the issue multiple times. In one case, a customer named R. Holloway had submitted 4 separate service requests over 7 months, and each one had been closed with the same notation: inspected, normal operation for unit age and usage. He set the report back down. Miss Sinclair, he said, choosing his words carefully. What exactly are you asking me to do? She looked at him directly. I want you to look at 3 more wheel assemblies. I had them pulled from service units this morning. They're in the SUV. I want your independent assessment of whether the issue you identified yesterday is present across multiple units, and if so, to what degree. I want your assessment in writing. A beat. I want it from someone who has no prior relationship with my company, no financial interest in a particular conclusion, and who identified this problem in 20 minutes when my own contractors missed it for months. The garage was quiet. Outside, Mason could hear a car going by on Callaway Street, the particular sound of tires on asphalt in the early morning when traffic was still thin. I'm a car mechanic, he said again. It felt important to keep saying. You understand hub motor assemblies. Not this brand-specific engineering. You understood enough yesterday. She didn't say it to flatter him. She said it the way someone stated a fact they'd already verified. I'm not asking you to testify in court. I'm asking for your professional mechanical assessment of whether a design or manufacturing defect is present and consistent across multiple units. Yes or no? He thought about the R. Holloway file. 4 service requests over 7 months. A real person, in a wheelchair they depended on, told 4 times that the clicking they were hearing was nothing. And all along, a collar was working itself loose, and friction was building. And at some point, at the kind of point that Mason had been watching for on a walking trail the previous afternoon, the chair would stop working. Not on a flat, maintained trail in a public park. Maybe somewhere else. Maybe somewhere worse. What's the rate? He said. Something in her expression relaxed. Not much, but enough that he caught it. $150 an hour, 4 hours minimum regardless of how long it actually takes. $600 minimum for a Sunday morning. He kept his face even. Fine. Let me get the assemblies. She told him the driver's name was Cal. Cal was a large, quiet man in his late 40s who opened the back of the SUV without being asked and showed Mason the 3 wheel assemblies wrapped in shop cloths and laid out in a cargo tray. Mason recognized quality packaging when he saw it. She'd had them pulled and transported carefully, not thrown in a bag. She'd been thinking about the integrity of what he'd be examining. He carried them inside 2 at a time. Lily appeared at 7 minutes past 9, in her pajamas, hair doing several things at once, 1 sock on and 1 off. She stood in the doorway between the garage and the kitchen and looked at Aurora Sinclair with the blank, assessing expression of a child who had not yet engaged their social filter. "You're the wheelchair lady," Lily said. "I am," Aurora said. "Your chair looks different today." "This is a different chair. A lighter one." Lily processed this. "How many wheelchairs do you have?" "Lily," Mason said. "It's fine," Aurora said. She looked at Lily with that same quality of attention Mason had noticed on the trail. Genuine, direct, not the performative brightness that adults often deployed toward children. "I have 4. 2 power chairs and 2 manual chairs. Different ones work better in different situations." Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. "That makes sense," she said finally. "My dad has 3 different kinds of screwdrivers." "I have considerably more than 3 kinds of screwdrivers," Mason said. "He has a lot of screwdrivers," Lily told Aurora, as if this confirmed something. Aurora looked at Mason briefly. Something moved in her eyes, quick, barely there. Not quite amusement, something more complicated than amusement. "Can I have cereal?" Lily asked Mason. "Bowls are where they always are." She disappeared back into the kitchen. They heard the refrigerator open. They heard, shortly after, the specific ceramic percussion of a 6-year-old getting cereal without incident, which was not guaranteed. Mason turned back to the assemblies on his workbench. He started with the first one. Used the same technique as the day before. Manual rotation, flashlight, systematic examination of the housing and bracket. He found the collar issue on the first unit within 6 minutes. On this one, the collar was the same undersized specification as Aurora's chair, and the wear on the bracket was at an earlier stage, maybe 3 or 4 months of accumulated friction rather than 6. He noted the measurements with a digital caliper he kept on the bench. He wrote them down in his actual handwriting on a legal pad, because he didn't currently have a better system for formal documentation, and he wasn't going to pretend he did. Second unit. He found it again. This time the collar had shifted enough that the motor mount was showing a crack beginning. Hairline. But there. The chair was closer to complete failure than Aurora's had been. If someone was using this chair regularly, they were probably already experiencing significant instability and almost certainly had reported it. He stopped. Looked at the report Aurora had left on the bench, found the unit serial number on the assembly's ID plate, found the matching serial number in the report. It was R. Holloway's chair. He sat there for a moment with the flashlight in his hand. Then he picked up the third unit. He found the same collar specification on the third unit. Less wear than the others. This chair was newer, maybe 4 months in service, and the collar hadn't shifted enough yet to cause motor disruption. But the fundamental defect was there. The wrong part, in the wrong position, doing what wrong parts did, which was fail on a schedule nobody could predict and nobody had bothered to understand. He turned around. Aurora was watching him from her chair near the workbench. She'd been quiet the entire time, not making calls, not looking at her phone, just sitting and watching him work the way someone watched a thing they needed to see clearly. "All 3, he said. She closed her eyes for just a second. "Same collar issue?" "Same specification defect across all 3. Different stages of wear, but the same root cause. Unit 2, he hesitated. Unit 2 has a crack developing in the motor mount bracket from the accumulated friction. That one needs to come out of service immediately. It's not safe. He watched her absorb this. She did it quietly, without visible drama, but he could see in the set of her shoulders and the particular stillness she'd gone into that this was not easy information to receive. "Unit 2 is registered to a customer?" he asked, though he already knew. "Yes. I'd make that call today." "I know." She opened her eyes. Her voice had not changed in pitch or pace, but it had gone to a different place. Something stripped of the controlled evenness, something that was just the thing underneath it. "How many units do you think are affected?" "I can't tell you that. I can tell you the defect is consistent across the units I've seen, which suggests it's not a one-off assembly error. If the collar was sourced to the wrong specification, the problem would exist in every unit where that collar was installed. You need the sourcing records to find out how many units that is and how far back it goes. My procurement director is pulling those records now. It's Sunday morning and he is not happy about it, but he's pulling them. He should pull them fast, Mason said, and not just for chairs that have already generated complaints. If the defect is in the sourcing, there are units out there that haven't failed yet, but will. She nodded slowly. I know. They were both quiet for a moment. The garage settled around them. The ordinary sounds of a small building, the distant noise of Calloway Street waking up, the muffled sounds of Lily in the kitchen having what appeared to be a conversation with her cereal bowl. The service contractors, Mason said carefully, the ones who looked at these units and called it normal. Yes. Were they looking at them and not seeing it, or looking at them and deciding not to see it? A long pause. She turned the coffee mug on the edge of the workbench slowly, a quarter turn one way and then back. I don't know yet. Both are possible. The answer to that question has different implications. Different financial implications for the contractors. Yes. And different implications for how long they might have known. Yes. She stopped turning the mug. I've been running Sinclair Mobility for 6 years. We build equipment for people who depend on it, not like a car you can get out of if it stops working. I have customers who use our chairs in places where a mechanical failure isn't an inconvenience. It's a crisis. She paused. When I started the company, I told every engineer, every contractor, every person involved in sourcing and assembly. I told them the same thing. The person in the chair is not a customer to me. They're a user of something that has to work, every time, because their life is built around it working. She stopped. Apparently that message didn't travel far enough. Mason looked at the three-wheel assemblies on his workbench, at the crack in our Holloway's motor mount bracket, which he could see from here without the flashlight, a hairline fracture in a piece of metal that had been failing for months while service contractors marked it normal and closed the ticket. I'll write up my formal assessment, he said. Everything I found, measurements, the crack in Unit 2, documentation of the collar specification defect across all 3 assemblies. You want that in writing? I'll give it to you in writing. Today, if possible. Today is fine. She reached back into the messenger bag, pulled out a document, a single page, clean and simple, and set it on the workbench beside the legal pad where he'd been taking notes. This is a consulting agreement. The rate we discussed, confidentiality provision standard in the industry, scope limited to mechanical assessment. If you want a lawyer to look at it before you sign, I can wait. He looked at the document. It was direct and clearly written, without the aggressive density of language that contracts sometimes used to obscure what they were actually saying. He read it through once carefully, which took about 4 minutes. Then he picked up the pen from the workbench and signed it. I don't need a lawyer, he said. I can read. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face, too brief to be sure. I noticed that about you. He pulled the legal pad back in front of him and started writing the formal assessment in the same practical, factual way he wrote up estimates for customers. What he found, where he found it, what it meant mechanically, what he recommended. He wrote about the collar specifications, the wear patterns, the bracket damage on Unit 2, the progression of failure across the 3 units arranged by severity. He wrote that in his professional assessment, the issue was consistent with a systemic sourcing defect rather than isolated assembly error, and that the presence of the defect in units at varying stages of wear was consistent with an ongoing problem rather than a corrected one. He was on the 3rd page of the assessment when Lily came back to the garage doorway, dressed now in her clothes for the day. Pink shirt, the mismatched shoes, hair approximately brushed. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Writing a report." She came over and looked at the legal pad. "It's very long." "Reports usually are." She looked at Aurora. "Are you staying for lunch?" "Lily," Mason started. "I don't know yet," Aurora said. "I might need to make some phone calls." Lily accepted this as a reasonable answer. She sat down on the stool near the empty bay and picked up one of her library books from the shelf where she kept a small rotating collection for garage visits and began to read with the self-sufficient air of a child who had spent a lot of time in the company of working adults. The garage was quiet except for the scratch of Mason's pen on the legal pad and the distant sound of Aurora on her phone making calls that were not going easily, and the occasional page turn from Lily's corner. Mason wrote for another 40 minutes. When he was done, He had 6 pages of handwritten notes that he then typed into his laptop. The same laptop he used for invoices and parts orders and the occasional desperate search for small business financing options, and printed on the small printer he kept on the shelf beside the computer. He handed the printed pages to Aurora. She read them there in the garage, in her transport chair, without asking him to wait while she took them somewhere else to review privately. He respected that. She read the full 6 pages, and he could see from the movement of her eyes that she was actually reading, not skimming. When she finished, she looked up. "You noted the R. Holloway unit specifically," she said. "The crack in the bracket is significant enough that it warranted individual notation. That chair shouldn't be in service another day. I'm calling that customer as soon as I leave here." She folded the report carefully and placed it in the messenger bag. Mason. She used his first name for the first time. It didn't seem unintentional. "What you've documented here, this is going to be used to justify a recall. A significant one, probably. Multiple units, multiple customers, public announcement, free repairs or replacements. It's going to cost the company considerably. It's going to be a difficult public moment." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know, before I leave here, that I'm going to use this report to do exactly that. Not to manage a PR problem, not to get ahead of a lawsuit, because the people in those chairs need to know." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "You know? I figured that out about you on the trail yesterday." She was quiet for a second. "From 20 minutes of watching me be stuck on a walking path? From the way you talked about the clicking sound. You knew it wasn't normal. You reported it 4 times through proper channels and got told you were wrong. That's not a person who's going to use a report like this to minimize the problem." Something shifted in her face again, that same quality he'd noticed before, the place where the controlled surface gave way briefly to whatever was underneath it. She looked down at her lap for a moment, at the messenger bag with the report inside it. "I'm going to need more from you," she said, looking back up. "The next few weeks are going to involve fleet-wide inspection, identifying every affected unit, coordinating repairs. I'd like your involvement in establishing the inspection criteria, what to look for, how to assess severity, what can be shimmied temporarily versus what needs full component replacement, working alongside my engineering team." A pause. "They're good people. They're going to be defensive. They should have caught this. I'm not going to make them feel bad about it," Mason said. "I know you won't. You don't seem like someone who does things to make people feel bad." She paused. "You seem like someone who does things to fix the problem." He pulled the legal pad back toward him, flipped to a clean page and wrote down his cell number and the garage's direct line, tore the page off and handed it to her. She took it, started toward the door, and then stopped. "The shims you used yesterday," she said, "on the trail, you just had those in your truck." "I keep a kit." "Because?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without it sounding like either false modesty or self-congratulation. "Because I've been the person stranded somewhere with a broken thing and no tools to fix it. It's not a feeling I like, and I don't want to give it to other people if I don't have to." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll be in touch this week. I'll be here." She went to the door and then stopped again, not turning fully back, just a half turn, and said, "Your daughter told me, while you were getting the assemblies from the car, that you make really good grilled cheese sandwiches." He blinked. "She said that?" She said, and I'm quoting accurately, "My dad's grilled cheeses are famous in this house." He laughed. It was the same short, surprised sound as the night before. "Famous in this house" is about the right scale. "It's a good scale," Aurora said quietly, and then she went out the door. He stood in the garage for a moment after the SUV pulled away, with the wheel assemblies still on his workbench and the legal pad in front of him, and the faint smell of coffee that had long since gone cold. He thought about R. Holloway's bracket, about 4 service tickets marked closed, about a collar that was 1.5 millimeters too small, a measurement you'd catch in 30 seconds with a caliper if you were looking for it. He thought about $600 minimum, and about the ongoing consulting work she'd described, and about the 2-week extension Dennis Farrow had given him on rent that was already overdue. He didn't let himself get ahead of it. He'd learned not to do that, not to take a good thing happening and expand it in his imagination into a solution for everything, because that was the fastest way to make a disappointment out of something that was just a thing that happened. The consulting job was real. The report was done. That was all he knew. He cleaned up the workbench, put the 3-wheel assemblies back in the cargo cloths, refiled his notes, checked the parts supplier's website one more time for the Hendricks back-ordered component. Still no update. Still the same vague shipping estimate that had been vague for 6 days now. Then he went inside to see if Lily wanted to actually go get that ice cream he'd promised yesterday and hadn't delivered. She did. She absolutely did. She was already putting on her shoes, both of them this time, a matched pair, which she announced with some ceremony before he'd finished the sentence. They went to Darby's Ice Cream on 5th Street, which had been there since Mason was Lily's age and had not updated its menu or its decor in visible ways since approximately 1987, and this was entirely the point. Lily got a scoop of birthday cake on a sugar cone. Mason got plain chocolate because it was the thing he always got, and he was not a person who experienced ice cream indecision. They sat outside on the metal chairs that were slightly uneven on the sidewalk and ate their ice cream, and Lily told him about the book she was reading, which involved a family of rabbits with unusual abilities, and Mason listened and nodded and put in the appropriate reactions at the appropriate times. The consulting fee sat in the back of his mind like a number he wasn't letting himself count on yet. The rent deadline sat beside it, the parts order, the financial file on the workbench. But right now, for this hour, he had ice cream and his daughter and the particular feeling of a Sunday morning becoming afternoon, and he let that be enough. He thought briefly about Aurora Sinclair driving across Clover Falls to make a phone call to R. Holloway, telling someone that the clicking sound they'd been reporting for 7 months was not normal after all, that their chair needed to come in, that they'd been right, and they'd been failed, and it was being fixed. He hoped Holloway had somewhere to go while the chair was repaired. He hoped the conversation went okay. He hoped Aurora made that call the same way she'd done everything else he'd watched her do, directly, and without flinching away from the hard part of it. He suspected she would. Lily's ice cream was dripping faster than she was eating it, the way it always did on days that were slightly warmer than they looked, and she didn't notice until it was running down her wrist, and she said, "Oh no," in the specific tone of someone for whom this was a significant event, and Mason handed her the napkins he'd had ready because he always had napkins ready, because she always did this. Some things you just learn to be prepared for. The call from Aurora came on Wednesday morning, 4 days after the ice cream and 3 days after Mason had deposited the consulting check, the full 4-hour minimum, $600, which he'd held in his hand for a long moment before walking it to the bank on Merchant Street because he didn't trust mobile deposit with something that felt this important to get right. He'd paid the parts supplier that same afternoon, $430, 47 days late, and the woman at the counter had said finally, in a tone that was not quite rude but was in the neighborhood of rude, and Mason had said, "Yeah," and meant it. The Hendricks part had arrived Tuesday. He'd finished the job by 4 in the afternoon and called Mr. Hendricks, who picked up the car that evening and paid in full without complaint, which made him one of Mason's better customers by simple virtue of not being difficult about it. $280, which brought the week's total to something that wasn't comfortable but was less catastrophic than it had been on Saturday morning. He was under the hood of a 2019 Silverado when Aurora called, an oil change and a brake inspection for a regular customer named Walt Ferris, who dropped the truck off every 8 weeks with the reliability of a man who had decided that preventive maintenance was a moral position. Mason had Walt's jobs memorized. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and answered on the 3rd ring. "The sourcing records came back," Aurora said without preamble. "I need you to come to our facility, today if possible." Something in her voice had changed from Sunday. Not harder exactly. More compressed. Like someone who had been holding a lot of weight in a small space and was being careful about how they carried it. "How bad?" Mason asked. A pause. "Worse than Sunday." He looked at the Silverado. Walt's brake inspection was going to take another 40 minutes, minimum. He had one more appointment at 2 o'clock, a transmission fluid exchange that was straightforward. After that, the afternoon was open in the particular way that a slow business's afternoons tended to be open. Not planned, just empty. "I can be there by 1, he said. "I'll have someone meet you at the gate." Another pause, shorter. "Mason, bring your legal pad." Sinclair Mobility Systems occupied a campus-style facility on the north side of Clover Falls, in the light industrial district that had grown up along Route 9 over the past 15 years. Mason had driven past it plenty of times without paying particular attention. A series of connected modern buildings behind a landscaped entrance, the kind of facility that looked professional without being ostentatious, the kind of place that had been built by someone who cared about function over appearance. He'd never had reason to go inside. The person who met him at the gate was a young man named Derek, who had the nervous energy of someone who'd been told to escort an important visitor and was taking the responsibility very seriously. Derek walked quickly, talked quickly, and used the phrase "Ms. Sinclair is expecting you" twice in the span of 4 minutes, as if Mason might forget where he was going. The interior of the main building was open plan, functional, with wide corridors wide enough for chair navigation and good natural light from high windows. Mason noticed immediately that roughly a third of the people he passed were wheelchair users, employees, not customers. It was not the most diverse thing he'd ever seen in a workplace, but it was more than he'd encountered in most, and the facility's layout reflected it in practical ways, not decorative ones. The workbenches in the assembly area, visible through a glass wall, were built at heights that accommodated people working from seated positions. The hallways had no lip transitions. The light switches were uniformly at chair height. It was a place built by someone who understood what it was to navigate the world in a chair, and who'd carried that understanding into every practical decision. Mason filed that away without comment. Aurora was in a conference room on the second floor. Accessible elevator, Derek was very clear about this, and she was not alone. There were 4 other people at the table when Mason came in. She made introductions quickly. Priya Sandhu, head of engineering, a compact woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair who looked like she hadn't slept well in several days. Tom Vickers, VP of operations, heavy-set, mid-50s, with the particular stillness of a man who had decided to stay quiet until he understood what kind of meeting this was. Renata Cruz, the company's general counsel, who had a legal pad of her own and a pen she was clicking with a rhythm that suggested controlled anxiety. And James Kalowski, the procurement director Mason had heard referenced on Sunday, a thin man in his early 60s with the air of someone who had spent the past 3 days reconstructing a paper trail he wished didn't exist. They all looked at Mason the way people looked at someone whose report had caused a problem and who was now present in the room where the problem was being managed. Not hostile exactly, but aware of him in a pointed way. Aurora gestured to the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," he said, and sat down and put his legal pad on the table because she'd told him to bring it and he was going to use it. James Kalowski spoke first because apparently he'd been waiting to. "Mr. Reed, I want to be clear about the scope of the sourcing issue before we proceed. The collar component in question was sourced from a vendor called Meridian Parts Supply, beginning approximately 14 months ago. The specification we provided to Meridian called for a collar with an inner diameter of 42.5 millimeters. The collars Meridian supplied have a consistent inner diameter of 41.0 millimeters. He paused, like he was waiting for Mason to calculate the significance of that. Mason did the calculation. 1.5 millimeters undersized. Consistently. Across the entire supply order. How many units? Kalowski looked at the papers in front of him. 217 chairs were assembled using collars from the Meridian supply order. The room was quiet. 217. Mason had looked at 4. Aurora's chair and the 3 assemblies on his workbench Sunday morning. 4 out of 217. And in those 4, he'd found consistent defects at varying stages of failure and 1 bracket that was already cracked and dangerous. He wrote the number down. "And what's the current status of those units?" "Deployed to customers," Aurora said. "All but 11, which are in our service inventory awaiting assignment. 153 are with individual users. 53 are in institutional accounts, care facilities, hospital programs, rehabilitation centers. 53 in institutional accounts." Mason thought about what that meant. Chairs shared between multiple users, potentially, or chairs used in environments where a failure created a more complex crisis than it did for a private user at home. "What's the failure rate?" he asked. Priya Sandhu answered that one. Based on the complaint data we've pulled, we can confirm symptomatic failure, clicking, instability, motor disruption in 61 units. But that's reported failures. Based on the wear progression you documented in your assessment, we think there are units with active defect progression that haven't yet reached the symptomatic threshold. She pushed a sheet of paper across the table. I modeled the wear curve from the 4 assemblies you examined. If the progression is consistent, we're looking at potentially 90 to 110 units currently in active failure progression, whether or not the user has noticed yet. Mason looked at the wear curve model on the paper. It was solid work, clean math, conservative assumptions, clearly documented. He noted that the model cited his 4-unit assessment data as the basis, which meant she'd used his numbers and trusted them enough to build from them. He thought that probably hadn't been easy for her. "Your model looks right to me," he said. "Based on what I saw, that progression rate is consistent." Priya nodded once tightly. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. Tom Vickers spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, deliberate. The voice of a man who had been in operational meetings for 30 years and knew how to slow a conversation down when it was moving toward a conclusion he hadn't fully processed. "I want to raise the question of scope before we move to any discussion of next steps. 217 units is the Meridian sourcing batch, but we haven't confirmed that every unit assembled with Meridian collars has the same defect level. The collar dimension is consistent, but the wear progression depends on usage patterns, environment, individual—" "Tom?" Aurora said. He stopped. "We're not narrowing the scope," she said. It was 3 words spoken in a quiet, flat voice, and it ended the sentence before it was finished. Not cruel, not a performance, just settled. Vickers looked at her. His jaw moved slightly. "Aurora, I'm not suggesting I know what you're suggesting, and I understand why. 217 units is a significant recall. The cost, the logistics, the PR impact. I understand what that means." She looked at him steadily. "I also understand that R. Holloway reported a problem 4 times and was told 4 times it was fine, and that Chair has a cracked bracket that should have come out of service months ago." A pause. "We are not doing a targeted recall of symptomatic units. We're doing a full recall of all affected units, all 217. Vickers sat back in his chair. He didn't argue further. He had the look of a man who had worked for Aurora long enough to know the difference between a position that could be negotiated and a position that was done. Renata Cruz, who had been clicking her pen throughout this exchange, stopped clicking. For the record, from a liability perspective, the full recall is also significantly cleaner. I'll prepare the announcement. "Thank you," Aurora said. She turned back to Mason. "The reason I needed you here is the inspection protocol. We need to establish a standardized assessment process that can be deployed across our service contractor network. Criteria for examining the collar and bracket condition, a severity scale, clear criteria for which units can receive a temporary shim repair while awaiting replacement parts, and which need to be pulled from service immediately." She paused. "What you did on Sunday morning, in your garage, with a flashlight and a caliper, I need that process documented in a way that a service technician can follow." Mason looked at his legal pad. This was the thing he was actually here for, and it was the thing he was most comfortable with. Not the corporate math, not the PR calculus, not the liability framework, the physical, practical question of how to look at a mechanical component and assess what was wrong with it and how wrong it was. "Okay," he said. "Let me walk through the examination sequence." He talked for 40 minutes. He walked them through the visual indicators, the heat staining pattern, the visible gap at the housing junction, the specific rotation test to feel for the catch point. He described the caliper measurements to take and what numbers to look for. He established a 3-level severity scale. Level 1 for units showing the specification defect but no measurable wear progression. Level 2 for units showing measurable wear but intact brackets. Level 3 for units showing bracket cracking or any level of structural compromise. Level 1 could receive a precision shim and remain in service with monitoring pending replacement parts. Level 2 needed the replacement collar installed within 48 hours and limited use in the interim. Level 3 came out of service immediately, period. Priya Sandhu asked questions throughout, good ones, technical ones, the kind that came from someone who understood the engineering well and was checking his logic against her own knowledge. He answered them directly and acknowledged twice when she raised a point that refined his thinking. Once about the relationship between chair weight capacity and bracket wear rate, once about environmental factors, specifically exposure to damp conditions, that could accelerate the failure progression. By the end of the 40 minutes, he had 9 pages of notes, and Priya had her own set of parallel notes, and they had something that could actually be turned into a coherent inspection protocol. Aurora had been quiet through most of it, listening, occasionally writing something down. As Mason finished walking through the level 3 criteria, she said, "I want you involved in the contractor training. When we deploy this protocol to the service network, I want you there, to walk the technicians through what you walked us through today." Vickers shifted in his seat. "That's Aurora. With respect, Mr. Reed is an outside consultant. Having him lead the contractor training might send a message about our own internal capacity that—" "Tom." Same quiet voice, same finality. "His protocol. His training." Vickers went quiet again. Mason looked across the table at Priya Sandhu, who was looking down at her notes with an expression that he couldn't fully read. She'd been the one whose team had missed this, whose engineers had signed off on assembly processes that let a wrong spec collar go undetected for 14 months. He knew this was the thing sitting in the room that no one had directly named yet, and he knew that eventually it would need to be named. He decided to be the one to name it. "I want to say something," he said. The room focused on him. The collar specification, a 42.5 millimeter spec that received 41.0 millimeter parts for 14 months. That's a receiving inspection failure. The parts should have been measured against the spec when they arrived from Meridian. If they had been, this would have been caught at the start. He looked at Priya, not accusatory, as close to neutral as he could make his face. "That's not about your team's competence with the engineering. That's a process gap in receiving quality control. It's fixable." Priya looked up from her notes. Her expression had the controlled tightness of someone who had been sitting with a specific guilt for 3 days and had not yet found the right way to set it down. "We have a QC process," she said. "The receiving inspection protocol for collar components called for dimensional verification on a sample basis, 10% of each delivery." "The sample protocol missed it across multiple deliveries," Mason said. "Yes. Which means the sample size is too small for this component, or the verification method needs to be more sensitive, or both." He paused. "That's the fix. 100% dimensional verification on collar components, or a better statistical sample with more sensitive tooling. Either way, it's a process fix." She looked at him for a moment. "You're making it sound simpler than it is." "I know it's not simple. I'm saying it's findable and fixable, and that's different from saying there was something wrong with your engineers." He kept his voice level. "There wasn't something wrong with your engineers. There was something wrong with the process. Those aren't the same thing." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Not the silence of people waiting or people holding something back. Just a moment of genuine stillness. Priya said quietly, "The sample protocol was my call. I implemented it 2 years ago as a cost and time-saving measure. I thought the vendor relationship was stable enough that—" She stopped. "It was my call." "Okay," Mason said. "Then you're the one who fixes it, and you'll fix it right because you know exactly where it failed." She looked at him like she wasn't sure what to do with that response. He wasn't sure either. He just said the true thing. Aurora was watching this exchange with an attention that Mason had learned in the past 4 days meant she was learning something she considered important. She had the quality, rare in people who ran things, of being genuinely interested in what happened when people talked to each other honestly in a room. Renata Cruz broke the silence by clicking her pen once, as if calling the room back to order. "The recall announcement. We need to discuss the public communication." What followed was a conversation Mason mostly listened to because contracts and public communications were not his expertise and he knew it. But the shape of the conversation was clear. Aurora's position was that the announcement would be complete, direct, and not buried. She was not interested in language that minimized the issue or distributed blame toward Meridian in ways that obscured Sinclair's responsibility for their own receiving process. Renata drafted language while they talked. Vickers suggested a few softening phrases. Aurora removed them. Mason watched this happen twice and then stopped watching because the pattern was established. The announcement would go out Friday. Every affected customer would receive a direct call before the public announcement. The calls were starting that afternoon. Aurora had a list of the 153 individual users in order of assessed risk. Level 3 units first, the ones with bracket damage, then Level 2, then Level 1. She was making some of the calls herself. The institutional accounts, Mason said when there was a pause. 53 units in care facilities and hospital programs. Some of those users might not be their own primary contacts. The facility staff might need different information than an individual user would. Aurora looked at him. Yes, I have a separate protocol for those accounts. We're treating them as priority alongside Level 3 individual units. A pause. Some of those users are nonverbal or have cognitive disabilities. I've been working with our customer relations team this morning on communication approaches for those accounts. He nodded. He hadn't doubted that she'd thought of it. He'd asked because it was the kind of thing that needed to be said aloud in a room so everyone in the room knew it was being handled, not assumed. The meeting broke up around 3:30. Priya left first, already back on her phone, already moving toward the process fixes Mason had named. Vickers left without saying much, nodding to Mason in the way of a man who had lost an argument gracefully and was processing it. Renata Cruz collected her materials and gave Mason a card, not for any specific reason he could identify, just the habit of counsel distributing cards in every room they occupied. James Kalowski lingered briefly to tell Mason, with the air of someone confessing something, that Meridian Parts Supply had been flagged as a low-cost alternative vendor 18 months ago, and the procurement decision to use them had been partly his, and he'd recommended them based on cost savings without adequately verifying their QC standards. I know, Mason said. It was in the sourcing records. I just wanted you to hear it from me. Kalowski paused. I've been in procurement for 30 years. This is the first time something I sourced hurt people. Mason looked at him. The chairs didn't fail catastrophically. Nobody got seriously hurt. Our Holloway's bracket caught before it failed completely, and they're getting a new chair. He said it without softness, but also without the additional weight that Kalowski seemed prepared to carry. Do the correction and do it right. That's the job now. Kalowski nodded, once, and left. Aurora was the only one left in the conference room. She was at the window. There was a view of the facility's east courtyard from here, a paved outdoor space with benches and planters, a few employees eating lunch. She had her phone in her hand but wasn't looking at it. You're going to make those calls yourself, Mason said. Not a question. Some of them, the Level 3 users. She turned back toward the room. Our Holloway is first. I talked to them briefly on Sunday, but I need to have a full conversation. Explain what we found, what we're doing, what the timeline is for their replacement unit. How did Sunday's call go? A pause. Hard. They were not surprised, which was worse in some ways than if they'd been shocked. They'd been told repeatedly that the issue wasn't real. Finding out it was real and had been real for months. She stopped. It was a hard call. Mason thought about the 4 service tickets. Inspected. Normal operation for unit age and usage. Stamped 4 times on 4 separate complaints by at least 2 different technicians who had either not looked carefully enough or had looked and decided not to see. The service contractors, he said. The ones who closed those tickets. I've terminated 2 contracts. Her voice was flat. The contractors whose technicians handled the Holloway unit specifically. The broader contractor network. We're auditing. The protocol you wrote today is going to be part of the requalification process. If they want to remain in our service network, they train on the new protocol, and they demonstrate that they've implemented better documentation and escalation standards. That's going to cost you some contractors. Yes. She didn't sound particularly troubled by this. Good. He gathered his legal pad and the papers she'd pushed across the table during the meeting. He stood up and noticed that he was tired in a specific way. Not the tired of physical labor, which he was used to, but the tired of having been in a room where a lot of heavy things were being decided and having been a factor in those decisions. It was not a comfortable kind of tired. I'll have the protocol written up formally tonight, he said. I'll send it to Priya directly, if that's all right, so she can start the technical formatting. That's fine. Aurora looked at him. I want to talk about the consulting engagement going forward. The next 4 to 6 weeks are going to be intensive. If you're available for it, the contractor training sessions, the fleet inspection oversight, the documentation work, I'd like to extend the contract. He kept his voice even. Same rate? Same rate. But I was thinking about adding an availability retainer, given that your garage's schedule is going to be disrupted. The garage. He hadn't let himself think too directly about the garage in the past 4 hours, because when he was in a room doing something that needed his attention, he gave it his attention and didn't divide it. But the garage was what it was. 3 oil change appointments this week, Walt Silverado, 1 more job on the calendar. Slow, consistently, persistently slow. I can manage the scheduling, he said. I know you can manage it. I'm saying I'd rather the consulting work not cost you garage income you need. She said it directly, without softness, the way she said most things. It's not charity, it's accounting. Your time has a cost, and I'd rather pay it than have it paid by your business. He looked at her for a moment. He was not always good at accepting the straightforward version of things. He had a lifelong habit of complicating generosity by wondering what it cost the person giving it, and whether they could afford it, and whether he should be receiving it. But Aurora Sinclair did not appear to be someone doing anything she couldn't afford, and she appeared to be someone who had thought about this the same way she thought about everything, practically, and ahead of time. All right, he said. A retainer is fine. Good. She moved toward the door. I'll have Renata draw up the extension. She paused in the doorway. Can I ask you something? Sure. When you were examining those assemblies on Sunday morning in your garage, you were writing notes in your own handwriting on a legal pad, which is... She stopped, chose her words. It's not how most people do formal documentation. I don't have a better system for it, he said. I've got a laptop for invoices, but I've never needed... He paused. I know it's not professional standard. It's completely legible and completely precise, she said. The notes were better than reports I get from people who have documentation software. I was just curious where you learned to do it. He thought about his father, bent over a workbench in the same garage before it was Mason's garage, writing up estimates in the same careful block print. The habit of writing down exactly what you found so that if someone asked you later, you could show them the thing itself, not your memory of the thing. My dad, he said. She nodded, as if this explained something she'd already half understood. I'll see you Friday for the first contractor training. Derek will send you the location and time. She left. He followed Derek back to the gate, through the wide corridors and the good natural light and the workbenches at the right heights for the people who worked at them. He got in his truck in the visitor lot and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. 4 to 6 weeks. A retainer. Contractor training sessions and fleet inspection oversight and documentation work. He pulled out his phone and did the rough math on the back of one of the papers from the meeting, in the margin, with a pen from his shirt pocket. He got a number. He looked at the number for a few seconds. He put the pen away. He drove back to the garage, changed into his work clothes, and finished Walt Ferris's brake inspection. The left front brake pad was at about 15%. He called Walt, got voicemail, left a message recommending replacement within the next month. He wrote it up in the service record. He noted it on the legal pad. He went in and made dinner, pasta with the jarred sauce that Lily tolerated but did not endorse as a culinary choice, her feelings on jarred versus homemade sauce being both strong and frequently expressed. She ate it without complaint tonight, which told him she was tired, and she asked him twice about the lady with the wheelchair without calling Aurora by name. Is her chair okay now? Lily asked. We're working on it. Are you helping her fix them? Yeah, a lot of them. Lily twirled pasta around her fork with concentration. How many? He thought about 217, about the wear curve Priya had modeled, about R. Holloway's 4 service tickets, about the 53 institutional accounts, about the calls Aurora was making right now, probably working down a list in order of assessed risk. A lot, he said. Enough. Lily accepted this. She ate her pasta. The evening moved into its ordinary rhythms. Dishes, homework, the reading she did before bed with the focused intensity of a child who had decided books were serious business. Mason helped with 2 spelling words she was uncertain about. He read 3 pages of the Rabbit book with her, doing the voices with the level of theatrical commitment that the story demanded, and that she would not accept any reduction of. He got her settled and went back to the garage and opened his laptop and started writing up the inspection protocol in proper document format, incorporating everything from the legal pad. He worked for 2.5 hours. He sent it to Priya Sandhu at 10:53 at night with a subject line that said simply, "Protocol draft. Please revise as needed." She replied at 11:17 with 14 specific technical comments and one line at the bottom that said, "This is good work. I'll format it for the contractor training materials." He read the message twice, put the laptop away, turned off the workbench light. He sat in the dark garage for a few minutes, in the quiet, with the smell of motor oil and the occasional sound of a car on Callaway Street. He thought about the crack in R. Holloway's bracket, about 1.5 millimeters, about the particular distance between a small thing going wrong and a person being stranded somewhere they didn't want to be stranded. He thought about a collar the wrong size, about a process gap in receiving inspection, about a service ticket marked closed 4 times on 4 separate visits, and the person on the other end of it being told repeatedly that what they were experiencing was nothing. Some problems were simple once you could see them. The hard part was seeing them. The hard part was refusing to look away once you did. He went inside. He checked on Lily, which he always did before he went to bed, even though she was always fine. Just the particular compulsion of a parent, the need to confirm with your own eyes the specific fact of your child's existence and safety. She was asleep on her side with one arm around the stuffed elephant that had been with her since she was 2, and she was breathing, and she was fine. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he went to bed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't lie awake doing the financial math. The recall announcement went live on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, Mason's phone had received 2 text messages from people he knew. Walt Ferris, who sent a news article link with no comment, and his cousin Brian in Pittsburgh, who sent the same article with the message, "Isn't this the company you're working for?" Mason confirmed it was. Brian sent back 3 question marks, and Mason left it at that. He read the announcement himself, the full text, sitting at his workbench with his coffee going cold beside him. Renata Cruz had written clean, direct language. No passive voice hiding the action, no ambiguous phrasing about units that may have been affected. The announcement stated clearly that Sinclair Mobility Systems had identified a manufacturing specification defect in the rear wheel assembly collar component of 217 power chair units, that the defect created a progressive failure risk, that all affected units were being recalled immediately for free inspection and repair or replacement, and that customers should contact the company directly to arrange service. There was a phone number. There was an email. There was a specific statement from Aurora, under her name and title, that read, "I want to be direct with our customers. We found a problem in our chairs that we should have found sooner. We are correcting it completely, at our expense, without exception. Every person who depends on a Sinclair chair deserves equipment that works, every time. We fell short of that standard, and we are fixing it." 11 words in the middle of that statement had not been Renata's draft. Mason knew this because he'd seen an earlier version during the Wednesday meeting. "We fell short of that standard, and we are fixing it." That was Aurora's sentence, inserted into the final version, and it was different from everything around it in the way that a thing written by the person who meant it is always different from a thing written by someone writing on their behalf. The response was not entirely positive. This surprised Mason slightly, and then it didn't. He'd understood intellectually that a recall announcement meant bad news for a company's reputation, but he'd underestimated the particular velocity of internet opinion, which moved faster than he'd been tracking from his position at the workbench of a small garage on Callaway Street. By Friday evening, there were people online calling it a cover-up, arguing that the timeline proved the company had known about the defect and delayed action. There were others, some of them Sinclair customers, who were grateful in the specific fierce way of people who had been worried about something and been told they were wrong to worry, and who were now vindicated and relieved in the same moment. There was a news segment on a local affiliate that led with the word recall in a font size that implied catastrophe. There was a segment on a different channel that led with Aurora's statement and framed it as a model of corporate accountability. Mason read a representative sample of the coverage and then put his phone down and went back to work because Walt Ferris's oil change was 36 hours overdue for scheduling, and he still had 2 other appointments to fit in before Monday. The contractor training began the following Tuesday at a Sinclair facility in Morganfield, 40 minutes from Clover Falls. There were 11 service contractors represented, a total of about 30 technicians, and Mason stood at the front of a room that had good lighting and a projection screen and a table with the disassembled wheel components laid out for hands-on examination, and he walked them through everything he'd written in the protocol. He was not a natural public speaker. He knew this about himself. He tended to talk too fast when he was uncertain of his audience, and he used more technical language than was always useful, and he had never in his life used a slide presentation as a communication tool, and he was not going to start now. He had his legal pad. He had the physical components. He had the 3-level severity scale in his head so completely that he could describe it in any order someone asked. What he found, about 20 minutes in, was that the technicians responded better to the physical demonstration than to anything else. When he held up R. Holloway's bracket, the one with the hairline crack that had been examined and cleared 4 times, and showed exactly where the crack was, and demonstrated how the manual rotation test would have identified the problem, the room changed. Not dramatically, but the quality of attention shifted. A technician in the 3rd row, a young woman named Cassie, who worked for a contractor out of the Morganfield area, raised her hand. "I think I looked at a chair like that," she said. 6 weeks ago. The customer said there was a clicking sound and I did the standard protocol inspection and I marked it clear. The room got a little quieter. "What was the standard protocol inspection?" Mason asked. "Visual inspection of the exterior housing, drive test for 30 feet in both directions. If the drive test came back stable, we closed the ticket." "Did the drive test tell you anything about the collar condition?" She looked at the components on the table. "No," she said. "The collar issue doesn't affect the drive test until the wear is already advanced." "Right. The drive test is measuring output, whether the chair moves correctly. The collar failure is happening inside the housing, in the input. By the time it affects the output enough to register on a drive test, the bracket is already taking wear damage." He paused. "The inspection protocol we've been running was measuring the wrong thing, not because the technicians were careless, because the protocol was designed without visibility into this particular failure mode." Cassie was still looking at the bracket in his hand. "I should go back to that customer. After this training, you should check your recent closed tickets against the Sinclair recall list. If any of your customers have affected serial numbers, they should already have received a direct call from Sinclair. But if you saw a unit and closed a clicking complaint in the last 6 months, that's worth reviewing." She nodded. She had the particular expression of someone doing a private, uncomfortable accounting. He didn't lean into it. That wasn't the point of being here. The point was the protocol in front of them and the components on the table, and making sure that the next time a Sinclair customer reported a clicking sound, the person who came to look at it knew what to actually look for. They spent 3 hours on the technical material. At the end, Mason answered questions for another 40 minutes, most of them good and specific. He noticed that the questions from Cassie and 2 other technicians in the room were particularly precise, the kind of questions that came from people already mentally replaying their recent service calls and trying to reconcile what they'd done against what they now understood about the failure mode. He answered each one directly and without editorializing, because the editorializing was something these people were doing on their own, without his help, and they didn't need more weight added to it. Aurora was not at the Tuesday training. She was in a series of meetings that Mason knew about because Derek, who had become a reliable source of logistical information, mentioned it when he picked Mason up at 7 that morning. A regulatory review meeting, a call with the company's insurance carrier, a session with the engineering team on the receiving inspection process overhaul. Her week was a series of consequences all arriving at the same time, which was what a recall looked like from the inside of the company that issued it. She appeared at the Thursday training, held at a different facility in Clover Falls itself. She came in about 45 minutes into Mason's session and sat at the back of the room in her power chair, the repaired one, Mason noticed, which meant Priya's team had already sourced the correct collar and done the replacement. She didn't interrupt. She listened the same way she'd listened in the conference room, with the quality of attention that made it clear she was processing and not just observing. Afterward, when the technicians had dispersed to the hands-on examination stations that Mason had set up along one wall, she came to the front of the room. "You're good at this," she said, without particular fanfare. "I'm good at the technical part," he said. "The standing in front of people part I'm working on." "You were fine at the standing in front of people part. I talked too fast for the first 15 minutes. And then you slowed down. When the woman in the third row, Cassie. When Cassie asked about her closed ticket and you saw the room shift, you slowed down after that." He hadn't consciously registered that he'd done it, but she was right. She had a hard thing to sit with. No point moving faster than the room. Aurora looked at him, not the assessing inventory of a situation look from the trail, and not the controlled, careful look from the conference room. Something more direct than either of those, less defended. "I've noticed that about you," she said. "You read what the room actually needs, not what you plan to give it." He didn't know what to do with that, so he moved to the nearest examination station and checked that the components were arranged correctly for the next group rotation, which needed no checking because he'd arranged them correctly the first time, but the motion gave him something to do. "How are the customer calls going?" he asked. She came to stand beside the station. "We're at 112 individual contacts completed. The institutional accounts are almost done. Those took longer because of the coordinating with facility staff that you flagged." A pause. "Our Holloway came in yesterday for their unit assessment. Level 3, as you documented. New unit. They took the replacement?" "After some conversation, yes." Her voice shifted. Not much, but he heard it. "They weren't sure they trusted us, which is a reasonable position." She was quiet for a moment. "I sat with them for an hour, in the service center, just talking, about their experience with the chair, with the service process, with the 4 times they were told nothing was wrong." She paused. "They use the chair for their job. They're a librarian. They cover a full library floor in 8 hours on that chair." Mason thought about that. A library floor, 8 hours. A chair that had been slowly failing for months while 4 service calls got closed is normal operation. "Are they okay?" he asked. "The new unit is right spec. Their facility's floor is smooth, and even so, the failure hadn't progressed to the point of causing a fall or a real crisis, right? They'd just been increasingly uncomfortable and increasingly anxious about whether the chair was safe. That anxiety is its own damage." She looked at the examination station in front of them without really seeing it. "They said, at the end of the hour when they were leaving, they said they appreciated that I came in person, that I didn't just send someone." He nodded. "I wasn't sure, going in, if that was the right call," she said. "Whether showing up personally would read as an executive managing a liability situation or as something genuine. I wasn't sure if I could make it genuine enough that the difference would be visible." "Could you?" A pause. "I think so. I hope so." She turned to look at him directly. "I'm not always good at that, at the visible, genuine part. People who know me professionally sometimes think I don't feel things the way other people do because I don't process them out loud in real time. I process them later, privately, and by then the moment has moved on." He looked at her. He thought about the trail on Saturday and the controlled evenness of her voice, even when she was stranded and frustrated, and the way that evenness had cracked just slightly when he'd gotten the chair moving again, just that brief, raw relief quickly sealed back over. "It was visible," he said, "on the trail. When the chair moved. You felt it." She looked at him for a moment. "You noticed that?" "I was watching the wheel, but yeah." Something in her face that wasn't quite a smile. It was something more like recognition, the expression of someone who has been seen accurately and is not sure whether to be relieved or unsettled by it. "That was a bad afternoon," she said. "I'd been on the trail for 20 minutes before you came by. I'd called the service line, I'd called my assistant, I'd called the contractor directly. Nobody was coming for at least an hour. I was watching people walk past and I was—" She stopped, started again. "I was angry, not just about being stuck, about the fact that this chair, which my own company built, which my own engineers designed, had failed in a public park, and I couldn't fix it, and I couldn't make anyone come fix it, and I couldn't even look angry about it because... Another stop. Because when you're in a wheelchair in a public space, the range of emotions you're allowed to visibly have is narrower than it is for other people. If I'd looked as angry as I was, somebody would have called for assistance as if I were in crisis. So I was sitting there being very calm and feeling anything but. The examination station sat between them, with its arranged components and its careful labeling, and Mason held what she'd said without rushing to respond to it. And then a man in a stained t-shirt crouched next to my wheel without being asked, she said, and the tone had shifted, lighter but not dismissive, and fixed it in 20 minutes, and wouldn't take any money for it. The t-shirt was clean, he said. The stain was on the collar. Completely different situation. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. A real one, not a social one. Short and genuine and a little surprised at itself. From across the room, one of the technicians called out a question about the caliper measurement tolerance for level 2 assessments, and Mason went to answer it, and the moment moved on the way moments did. But it left something in the room that hadn't been there before, some small shift in the atmosphere, and both of them felt it without naming it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Mason hadn't expected. Tuesdays and Thursdays, he was at contractor training sessions or fleet inspection oversight meetings. The other days he was at the garage, keeping his regular appointments, picking Lily up from school at 3:15, making dinner, going through the ordinary mechanics of a life that was no longer quite in crisis, but hadn't yet fully settled into something he could call stable. He paid October's rent on time for the first time in 4 months, and Dennis Farrow said, "Thank you, Mason," in a tone that was almost warm, which from Dennis was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The consulting retainer showed up on his account on the 1st of October, and he sat with his online banking open for a while after seeing it, not doing anything with it, just looking at the number. Then he transferred a portion of it to a savings account he hadn't used in 18 months, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a person who was building something rather than just keeping something from falling apart. He and Aurora talked most days, usually by phone, about logistics, which contractor sites still needed training, what the fleet inspection data was showing as they got deeper into the 217 units, which institutional accounts needed follow-up. The calls were professional, task-oriented, often brief. But they had a quality to them that Mason noticed and didn't entirely know how to categorize. A conversational ease that hadn't been there in the first week and was definitely there now. The way she'd say something dry and expect him to catch it. The way he'd report something technically complex, and she'd ask one precise question that went directly to the part he hadn't fully resolved yet. The way neither of them wasted time on preamble. He'd been on a call with her on a Wednesday evening. Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table. Mason was in the garage with the phone on speaker while he worked on a fuel system issue for a customer named Grady, who drove his car hard and maintained it rarely. When Aurora said in the middle of discussing the Northeastern contractor audit, "Can I ask you something off topic?" "Sure," he said, without stopping what he was doing. "Does Lily actually do her homework, or does she do what I suspect she does, which is perform doing her homework while actually reading something else under the table?" He paused, looked toward the kitchen window, through which Lily was dimly visible at the table. "How did you—" "The 3 times I've been at your garage when she came home from school, she's had a library book in her backpack that she checks on with a regularity that is incompatible with a person planning to wait until after homework to read it." He laughed. He heard Aurora do the small sound she made that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to it. "She does both simultaneously," he said. "She claims she can read and absorb math worksheets at the same time. The test scores suggest she's not wrong. Smart kid. She's going to be more capable than me by the time she's 12, and I've accepted it." A pause. Not uncomfortable, just a natural rest in a conversation. Then Aurora said, "How's the garage really? Not the retainer and the consulting hours. The garage itself." He considered how to answer that honestly. "Slow," he said. "It's been slow for 2 years. I don't have a marketing strategy. I don't have an online presence beyond a listing in the local directory. My customers are mostly regulars and word of mouth from regulars. I'm good at what I do, but I've been running the business the same way my dad did in 1998, and the market isn't 1998 anymore. Have you thought about changing that?" "I think about it. I don't know what the change looks like. You have a reputation now, she said carefully. Whether you wanted one or not, you're the mechanic who caught the defect that my internal team and 2 service contractors missed. That's going to be part of the recall coverage, with attribution. I wanted to tell you that the news story that the Morganfield Tribune is running this week names you specifically. I tried to keep the attribution general, but the reporter was persistent. Mason had not been aware of this. He set down the wrench he was holding. You should have told me that was coming. I know. I'm sorry. I found out this morning that they were running the specific version with your name, and I should have called you immediately. No hedge in the apology, no qualification. Do you want me to push back on it? He thought about it. He thought about the garage and the business directory listing and 2 years of slow. He thought about his father's name on the plywood sign above the bay doors, repainted in Mason's own hand. No, he said. Let it run. Okay. It's the true story. Yes, it is. She came to the garage for the first time, not for a professional reason, on a Saturday in mid-October. She'd called the night before and asked, almost in passing, whether he had the diagnostic equipment to look at a steering pull she'd noticed in her personal vehicle. Not the SUV with the driver, her own car, a 5-year-old sedan that she drove herself using hand controls. Mason had said yes, and Saturday morning she'd shown up at 9 and he'd put the car on the lift and found a worn tie rod end on the right side, which was a straightforward repair that he did while she sat at the workbench with a coffee and her laptop and worked, apparently unbothered by the noise and the smell of a working garage. Lily appeared at 9:40, having been informed the night before that Aurora was coming, with a composure that collapsed immediately upon entering the garage. You drove here yourself? She asked Aurora, regarding the car on the lift with significant interest. I did. With your hands? There are hand controls for the gas and the brake. You steer with your hands normally. Lily looked at the underside of the car visible from the lift, then back at Aurora. Can I see them? Lily, Mason started. When we bring it down, sure, Aurora said. When the car came down and the tie rod was replaced and Mason had done the alignment check, Lily stood at the driver's door and looked at the hand controls with the focused intensity she brought to any mechanical thing. Aurora showed her which was the accelerator and which was the brake and how the mechanism worked, and Lily asked 4 questions, each more specific than the last, and Aurora answered all of them directly, without the condescension that adults sometimes showed children who asked technical questions, the implicit suggestion that a 6-year-old couldn't actually understand the answer. Lily understood the answer every time. She's going to be an engineer, Aurora said to Mason quietly, while Lily was still examining the controls with the seriousness of someone taking inventory. She says she wants to fix cars, Mason said. Same thing, if she wants it to be. He looked at Lily, who was now asking Aurora whether you could put hand controls on any car or only specific kinds, and Aurora was explaining the modification process, and Lily was listening with that total absorption she had for things that interested her. You're good with her, Mason said. Aurora looked at him. She's easy to be good with. She treats every conversation like it's a real conversation. She always has, from the time she could talk. It's a little intimidating sometimes. Aurora smiled. A real one, fully formed, not the brief flicker he'd been cataloging. She gets that from somewhere. He looked away first. He drove home from the grocery store on a Tuesday 2 weeks later, a quick trip after picking Lily up, milk and bread and the specific brand of yogurt that Lily had decided was the only acceptable yogurt, a position she held with the conviction of a food critic. And he sat in the parking lot for a moment before starting the car, because Aurora had just texted him a photo with no caption. The photo was of a wheel assembly. A new one, still in packaging, with the collar component visible and a caliper measurement resting against it. The number on the caliper display was 42.5 millimeters. Exactly right. The first delivery from the replacement vendor, precisely to spec, measured and documented before it ever reached the assembly floor. He sat there in the parking lot, looking at this photo of a mechanical part for longer than was probably explicable. Then he texted back, 42.5. She replied, 42.5. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped Lily with the spelling words. There were 7 of them this week, 3 of which she'd already memorized, and 4 of which she was working on with the dogged persistence she applied to things that didn't come easily. He did the dishes. He read 3 more pages of the Rabbit book, doing the voices. He lay in bed that night and looked at the ceiling and tried to think clearly about what was happening, which was what he always did when he was trying to avoid thinking clearly about something. He'd been divorced for 2 years. The divorce had been not bad exactly, not dramatic, just the quiet ending of something that hadn't been working for a long time, between 2 people who had married young and grown into adults who wanted different things. His ex-wife, Carla, had moved to Portland 2 years ago and was remarried and seemed, from the carefully limited contact they maintained around Lily's custody arrangements, genuinely happy. He didn't begrudge her that. He'd had the low-level ache of it for the first year, and then that had mostly resolved into a kind of neutrality that he took to be healthy. He hadn't been interested in anyone since Carla. He told himself this was because he was busy and tired and had Lily to think about, and a garage to keep running, and those were real reasons, all of them true. But he also knew that true reasons and complete reasons were not always the same thing. He thought about Aurora on the trail 8 weeks ago, trying to be calm about being stuck, about the way she'd looked at Lily explaining the motor, about the laugh in the contractor training room that had surprised itself, about 42.5 texted back with nothing around it. He was not the kind of man who built things up in his head and convinced himself they were something they weren't. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. He was the kind of man who looked directly at the thing in front of him and tried to see it clearly. What was directly in front of him was complicated. She was his employer, functionally. She ran a company that employed several hundred people. She was careful and controlled and processed things privately and late, by her own description. He didn't have a clean word for what she was, actually. The ones he reached for all felt inadequate or presumptuous or both. She was someone he looked forward to talking to, even when it was about collar specifications and contractor audits. Maybe especially then, because those were the conversations where she was most directly herself. Precise and practical, and occasionally dry in a way that caught him off guard. He turned over and tried to sleep. He had a 6:30 appointment tomorrow, the fuel system Grady had come back about because Mason had told him the car needed additional work, and Grady had decided, on reflection, that Mason was probably right. It was 10:45. He had the alarm set for 5:50. He should sleep. He thought 42.5. He thought about how she'd measured it herself, not delegated it to someone on the quality team, taken the caliper in her own hands and measured the collar herself against the specification she'd been unable to trust anyone else to honor, and then sent him the photo because she knew he'd understand exactly why it mattered. He understood exactly why it mattered. He closed his eyes, thought about the garage, about the plywood sign with his name on it and his father's name before it, and the 2 years of slow, and how last week he'd had 4 new customers who'd called because of the Tribune article, and how the week before that he'd had 3, and how the financial file on the workbench looked different now than it had looked the Saturday he'd packed a backpack with crackers and taken his daughter to a park because it was free and they needed a normal afternoon. Some things you couldn't plan for, his father used to say. Most of the things that mattered, you couldn't plan for. You just had to be paying attention when they happened and willing to move when they asked you to move. He fell asleep thinking about that, and about a caliper reading 42.5. And the person who'd taken that measurement alone and sent it to him with nothing around it, trusting him to know what it meant. He'd known. The last contractor training session happened on a Thursday in early November at a facility in Harwick, 60 miles from Clover Falls, in a room that smelled like industrial carpet and old coffee and the particular staleness of a space used for meetings and nothing else. Mason had done 7 of these sessions over 6 weeks. By the 7th one, he had stopped talking too fast, had stopped consulting his legal pad for anything except specific measurements, and had developed a way of reading a room full of service technicians that told him within the first 10 minutes who was genuinely engaged and who was going through a required exercise, and how to talk to both groups without losing either. He drove back from Harwick in the early evening with the radio off, which was unusual for him. He liked the radio, had grown up with it on in the background of the garage, his father's preference for country stations gradually giving way over the years to whatever Mason happened to land on, which was usually classic rock or sports talk depending on his mood. The silence tonight was deliberate. He wanted to think, and he thought better without noise. 6 weeks, 217 units, 194 had been inspected and assessed. Of those, 61 were level 3, pulled from service, users placed in loaner units while replacements were built to correct specification. 82 were level 2, repaired in the field with correct collars, brackets assessed, and cleared or replaced as needed. 51 were level 1, collar replaced, brackets intact, returned to service with monitoring. The remaining 23 were the units that had been in Sinclair's service inventory, never deployed, never put in someone's hands. Those had been quarantined on the second day of the recall and were being disassembled for component salvage. Every number in that accounting was a person or a potential person. Every level 3 was someone who had handed over a chair they depended on and was waiting for a replacement. Every level 1 was someone who now had a correct part in their wheel where an incorrect one had been, and who would never know how close they'd come to being stranded somewhere, because the failure hadn't progressed far enough before it was caught. Mason thought about this on the drive home. About the 62 people who hadn't been R. Holloway, who hadn't pushed back against 4 closed service tickets, who hadn't persisted, because they'd been told it was fine and they'd believed it, and their brackets had been progressing toward cracking the whole time. He thought about the 11 units still outstanding in the fleet, units that hadn't been located yet because 2 customers had moved and update contact information hadn't been filed, and 1 unit that was with a customer who had, for reasons Mason didn't fully understand, not responded to the company's outreach and not surrendered the chair for inspection. Renata Cruz was handling that last situation through a different channel because a person had a right to their own equipment and you couldn't compel an inspection, but you also couldn't sign off on a fleet as cleared when there was a level unknown unit still unaccounted for. He pulled off Route 9 onto the Callaway Street exit just before 6. The garage came into view at the end of the block. The plywood sign, the 2 bay doors, the side light on above the door that he always left burning when he was going to be back late. Lily was at his neighbor Janet's house, a standing arrangement for Thursdays when Mason was in Harwick. Janet was 63 and had been feeding Lily dinner on training Thursdays since September, and in return, Mason had fixed Janet's Civic twice at no charge, though Janet insisted on paying him in casseroles, which he was genuinely not going to argue with because Janet's casseroles were extraordinary. He picked Lily up at 6:15. She was in the middle of a card game with Janet that had reached a point of competitive intensity that suggested the outcome would affect their relationship. Mason waited until the hand was finished. Lily won, and was gracious about it in the slightly theatrical way of a 6-year-old who had been told that being a good winner was important and was trying, and then got her into her coat and said his thank yous and walked her home in the November dark with her small hand in his and the cold air making their breath visible in the porch light. "Is the training done?" Lily asked. "Last one was today." "Did you do the voices again?" He'd made the mistake of telling her early on that explaining the manual rotation test to 30 technicians felt like performing rather than teaching, and she had decided that this meant he did voices in his trainings. He'd tried to clarify this several times without success. "I don't do voices. I demonstrate a mechanical procedure." "That's what doing voices is," she said, with the authority of someone who had settled this question privately some time ago. He didn't have a comeback for this. At home, she had the bath and the homework and the reading and the 3 pages of the rabbit book. They were near the end now, the final complications of the story gathering the way endings did, and Lily had already asked twice whether everything was going to be okay for the rabbit family, and Mason had said yes because he'd read ahead to verify this before reassuring her. She fell asleep faster than usual, tired from the card game and the week, and he stood in the doorway of her room for the familiar moment before going back to the garage. He wasn't working tonight. He sat at the workbench with the financial file open, not because he needed to study it anxiously, but because he had, finally, reached the point of being able to look at it without the specific dread that had accompanied it for the better part of 2 years. October's bills were paid. November's rent was paid. The parts supplier was current. The credit card was down to $211. The savings account had money in it that wasn't immediately needed for anything, which was a condition he hadn't experienced since before his father died. He'd also had 11 new customers in the past 6 weeks, most of whom had called because of the Tribune article, or word of it, which had spread in the small, particular way that local stories spread. One person to another, the mechanic who'd caught the defect, the single dad from Callaway Street. 2 of the 11 had become regulars. 3 more had made appointments for December. It wasn't a flood of business, but it was the slow accrual of something being built, which was different from the slow drain of something struggling to survive. And Mason understood the difference in his body as much as in the numbers. He closed the file, left it on the workbench, went inside. The call from Aurora came at 8:47. He was on the couch with the television on low, not really watching it, in the particular unfocused state of someone who has been working hard for a sustained period and has run out of the structure that work provides and doesn't quite know what to do with the quiet. "Last session was today," she said, when he picked up. "Yeah. How was Harwick?" "Good. Better than the first one." He paused. "Different crowd. The Harwick contractors work a lot of rural service calls, more isolated environments. They had good questions about what to do when a unit needs to come out of service, and the customer doesn't have a backup option, and the nearest facility is 40 minutes away." "What did you tell them?" "That the company needed a loaner deployment protocol for rural accounts, because the current process assumes a customer can get to a service center within a reasonable time frame, and for rural users that assumption is wrong." A pause. "Did you document that?" "Sent it to Priya this afternoon before I left Harwick." He heard what might have been a small exhale, the kind that was equal parts amusement and something else. "You're going to keep finding things wrong with our processes long after your contract ends." "Probably," he said. "You can ignore them if you want." "I won't." He knew she wouldn't. He'd learned that about her over 6 weeks, that she had a particular intolerance for identified problems that nobody acted on, that she processed slowly and privately, but once something was understood, it moved directly into action, that there was no meaningful gap in her between knowing something needed to be different and beginning to make it different. It was a quality he recognized because he shared a version of it, though his operated at the scale of a one-man garage, and hers operated at the scale of a company with several hundred employees and a national service network. "The 2 unlocated units," he said. "One of them confirmed yesterday. The customer had moved to Phoenix and the address update was filed with the wrong account number. Sinclair's contact team found them through a warranty registration cross-reference." She paused. "Level 1. Caller replaced remotely through a partner service center in Phoenix. Chairs clean." "That's one." "That's one. The last unit," the customer who hasn't responded, "Renata has been in contact with their emergency contact, a family member. The customer has been hospitalized and the chair is currently at their home, not in use. The family is going to facilitate access for inspection as soon as the customer is stable." Mason absorbed this, the weight of it. A person in a hospital, their chair sitting at home. The chair that might be level 3, might be level 1, unknowable until someone could get to it. "I hope they're okay," he said, and meant it simply. "So do I." Aurora was quiet for a moment. "When the inspection is done, that's the fleet. 217 units accounted for." He looked at the ceiling. 217. He'd been carrying that number for 6 weeks, waking up with it, going to sleep with it, tracking it through inspections and service calls and training sessions. The idea of it being resolved, fully and completely, felt like something he needed to actually sit with for a moment. "What happens after?" he said. "For the company?" She considered. "Priya is implementing the new receiving inspection protocol starting next month. 100% dimensional verification on all collar class components, new tooling, new documentation requirements. We've ended the Meridian contract, and we're in the process of qualifying 2 new vendors with better QC standards. James is rebuilding the procurement review process from the ground up." A pause. "Tom Vickers is still working through his part in it. He fought me on the scope of the recall at the beginning, which I understand operationally, but the conversation we had in that conference room, the one where you said Tom, and he stopped talking. That one. That's not the last conversation we're going to need to have about how he thinks about customers versus costs. We're having it slowly. She paused again. He's not a bad person. He's a person who learned to manage a certain kind of risk and hasn't fully updated his framework for the kind of company I'm trying to run. Mason thought about that. About the difficulty of changing not just a process, but the framework inside which a person understood what their job was. That's a long project, he said. Most of the important ones are. He got up and walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, stood at the window. The backyard was dark. The fence, the bare November trees visible over it, the particular stillness of a cold night when the neighborhood had gone quiet. Mason, Aurora said. Yeah. I want to do something, and I need your input on whether it's a good idea or whether I'm misjudging the situation. He waited. There's a park event I'm planning, a community safety event at Riverside Green. In the spring, probably late April or early May, when the weather is reliable. The idea is to bring together mobility equipment users, caregivers, family members, anyone who interacts with this kind of technology, and offer free safety assessments on their equipment, not just Sinclair products. Any manufacturer. Bring your chair, bring your equipment, and our team will assess it for free and flag any issues. She paused. The recall has been in the news. The trust issue is real, and it's going to take time to rebuild it. I think something like this, public, accessible, genuinely useful to people, is part of how you rebuild it. He thought about it, about the park, the trail, the September afternoon, the specific spot where he'd first seen her, the chair listing to the left, the way she'd been so carefully calm. At Riverside Green specifically? At Riverside Green specifically. A beat. I'm aware of what I'm doing. I'm not being sentimental about the location, or only sentimental. The park is accessible. It's central. It's the kind of place where the people I want to reach actually go. It's also... She stopped. Yes, I'm being a little sentimental about the location. He smiled, and she couldn't see it, but it was there. It's a good idea, he said. The event. You think so? Community safety assessment at a public park. Free. Open to all equipment, not just yours. Yeah, that's real. That's not a PR event wearing a community service costume. That's an actual useful thing. The difference matters to you. The difference matters to the people who show up. He paused. You'd need hands-on assessment staff who know multiple manufacturers' equipment. That's a gap. Your team knows Sinclair products well, but other manufacturers' systems are different. I know. I've been thinking about that. Cross-training some technicians on the major competing product lines. It's a cost, but it makes the event real instead of promotional. Yes, another pause. I'd want you there. He was quiet for a moment. In what capacity? A longer pause than usual. When she spoke, her voice had the particular care of someone who had thought about how to say something and was now committed to saying it. Not as a consultant. The consulting contract will be wrapped up by then. The fleet is done, the protocol is implemented, the training is complete. You'll have finished the work I hired you for. She paused again. I'd want you there as someone I wanted there, as a person, not a role. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator made its usual sound. The house around him was the house it always was. A little worn, a little small, entirely his, with his daughter sleeping down the hall and his garage attached to the side, and the battered financial file on the workbench that looked, for the first time in 2 years, like something he was on top of rather than underneath. Aurora, he said. You don't have to answer that now, she said quickly, and he could hear in her voice the self-protective instinct of someone who'd said a true thing and was already preparing to manage the response. I'm aware that I've just said something that complicates a professional relationship that's been functional and important, and if you need to, I'd like to be there, he said, as a person. Silence. Okay, she said. The word was simple, but the way she said it wasn't. He stood at the kitchen window for another minute after they hung up, looking at the dark backyard, and he let himself feel the specific vertigo of something beginning, not the forced optimism of someone who needed things to be good, but the genuine uncertainty of someone standing at the start of something they couldn't map yet. It was uncomfortable, and it was real, and he didn't try to resolve it into anything cleaner than it was. The park event happened on the last Saturday of April, and the kind of spring weather that felt like a promise being kept after a long winter. Clear sky, warm enough without being hot, the trees along the Alcott River fully leafed, and the trail well attended with the particular energy of people who had been waiting for a reason to be outside. Sinclair Mobility's setup occupied the open field adjacent to the main trail junction. 6 assessment stations, each staffed by trained technicians who had spent the past 2 months cross-training on 4 manufacturers' product lines. There were information tables with printed guides about what users could ask their service contractors, a demonstration area where Priya Sandhu's engineering team walked through the inspection process on display equipment so that users could see exactly what was being checked and why. There was a feedback station where people could log complaints about past service experiences, anonymously if they chose, that Renata Cruz's team was going to analyze for systemic patterns in the industry, not just at Sinclair. Mason had helped design the assessment station layout, not because Aurora had asked him to, but because she'd sent him the initial proposal and he'd looked at it and thought the traffic flow was wrong for a population that included a high proportion of wheelchair users, and he'd sent back a revised diagram and she'd implemented it. That was how most things between them worked now. Practical, direct, neither of them waiting for permission to say the true thing. He arrived at 8:30 to help with setup, and he worked alongside the Sinclair technicians for 2 hours arranging equipment and testing the assessment tools, and helping 2 technicians resolve a disagreement about the correct caliper technique for a specific component measurement that he was not technically contracted to resolve, but which he resolved anyway because it was in front of him and he knew the answer. By 10 o'clock, when the event officially opened, there were already 40 people waiting. By noon, there were more than 120 people who had come through, from Clover Falls and Morganfield and 3 other towns within 30 miles. Some had come because of the recall coverage and wanted to know if their own equipment was safe. Some had come because they'd seen the flyers and had been meaning to have their chair looked at for a while, and this was a free and accessible occasion. Some had come because they'd heard about it through the networks of the disability community that operated with an efficiency and reach that formal advertising rarely achieved, because when something genuinely useful happened, people who needed it told each other about it directly. R. Holloway was there. Mason recognized them from the service file description. He'd never seen them in person, had only known them as a name attached to 4 closed service tickets and a cracked bracket. They were a tall person in their early 50s with short gray hair and an expression of someone who had learned to be measured in their expectations. They were at the feedback station when Mason noticed them, talking to one of Renata's team members with the focused attention of someone who had things to say and had waited a long time to say them in a venue where it might matter. He didn't approach them. It wasn't his place, but he watched long enough to see that the conversation was real, that the team member was writing things down and asking follow-up questions and not managing R. Holloway toward a predetermined end, and that Holloway was being heard. Aurora was across the field when he looked up. She was in her power chair, the original one, fully repaired with the correct collar and a replaced bracket, brought back to proper specification by Priya's team months ago. She was talking to a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, who was in a manual chair, a cheaper model than the Sinclair line, and looking at one of the printed inspection guides with the focused uncertainty of someone who had questions they didn't know how to ask. He watched Aurora angle her chair to be directly level with the young woman, not turned toward her from an angle but parallel and even, so they were talking side by side rather than one looking down at the other, or across some implied distance. He watched Aurora point to something on the guide and explain it. He watched the young woman's expression change, the particular shift from guarded uncertainty to something more like solid ground under her feet. He thought, that is a person who knows what it is to need the right information and not be sure you're going to get it straight. He thought, that is the thing she carries into every room she's ever in. He looked away and went back to the assessment station, where a man named Gerald had brought in a chair that hadn't been serviced in 3 years and turned out to have 4 separate issues of varying severity. None of them Sinclair-related, none of them catastrophic yet, all of them findable in 20 minutes if you were looking for them with the right tools and the right framework. He documented all 4, gave Gerald a written report, handwritten on the form they'd designed for the event, clean, clear, prioritized by severity, told him which one to get fixed first and approximately what it should cost from any qualified service center, and what to ask for specifically. Gerald was 68 and had been using the chair for 5 years and had never had anyone explain the equipment to him in terms he could actually use. "Is this going to be expensive?" Gerald asked, looking at the report. "The most urgent issue is a brake adjustment. That should be 2 hours of labor at most. The other 3 items are monitoring. You want to have them looked at within 6 months, but none of them are immediate." He paused. "The brake thing, don't wait on. Braking inconsistency on a power chair is the kind of thing that's fine until it isn't." Gerald nodded. He folded the report carefully, like it was a thing with value, which it was. "Nobody ever told me what to look for," he said. It wasn't a complaint exactly, more like an observation about the way things had been. "I know," Mason said. "That's why we're here." He said it simply, without ceremony, and moved to the next person in line. Around 2 in the afternoon, the crowd began to thin, the peak of the event giving way to the quieter, longer tail of people still coming but more slowly. Mason took a break, sat on one of the benches near the trail junction, the same general section of trail where he'd first seen Aurora 8 months ago, though he hadn't consciously chosen the bench for that reason and only realized it after he sat down. Lily found him there approximately 90 seconds later. She'd been at the event since 11, initially with Janet, who had come to help with the information tables and who had turned out to be extremely good at explaining things to people in accessible terms, an ability Mason had never had occasion to discover before. Lily had spent the morning investigating every assessment station with the thorough personal interest of a 6-year-old conducting field research, and had apparently made friends with 2 of Priya's junior engineers who had taught her how to use a caliper under sufficiently controlled conditions. "I measured something," she announced, sitting next to him on the bench. "What did you measure?" "A bracket, one of the display ones." She showed him the number she'd written on her hand in pen. She didn't have paper, and she'd needed to record the measurement, so... "Is that a good number?" He looked at the number. She was 0.03 of a millimeter off the spec. He was not going to tell her she was off because she had used a caliper correctly and independently at 6 years old, and that was the actual information worth transmitting. "That's a really good number," he said. She looked pleased in the quiet, self-contained way she got when she'd done something she was actually proud of. She sat with him on the bench for a while, watching the field, the assessment stations, the people moving through. "There she is," Lily said. He looked. Aurora was crossing the field toward them, moving along the paved section of the path. She'd spent most of the day talking to people, moving from station to station, stopping to listen and to answer questions with the directness she brought to everything. Her hair was different than it had been in September, a little longer, a little less pulled back and controlled, which he might have been reading too much into or might not have been. She reached the bench and stopped, looked at both of them. "How's it going?" Mason asked. "The feedback station has been running for 4 hours and they've logged 214 separate responses." She said it with the controlled expression of someone trying not to let the number fully land on her face yet. "From users across 7 manufacturers. Service experience, equipment reliability, communication issues." A pause. 214 people who came to a park on a Saturday because they had things to say about their equipment and their care that they hadn't had a venue to say. "Are you surprised?" he asked. She looked at him. "No. I'm angry that it took this long to build the venue." Lily was looking up at Aurora. "Did you know," she said, with the conversational entrance of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to deploy information, "that I measured a bracket today?" Aurora looked at her. "I heard. Priya texted me." Lily's eyes went wide. "She texted you about me?" She said, and I'm quoting accurately, "The small one measured the display bracket, and she was almost exactly right." Lily sat with this for a moment, being described as the small one by an engineer who had texted the company founder about her caliper work. "Almost exactly right," she said, tasting the words. 300ths off, Mason said. "That's almost exactly right," Lily confirmed, and apparently decided this was satisfactory, and went back to watching the field. Aurora looked at Mason. The afternoon light was the same particular September quality it had been that first day, low and golden, the kind that made everything look a little more itself. He'd noticed that about autumn light when he was a kid, working in the garage with his father, how the late-season sun came in through the bay doors at an angle that made the metal components look like they were lit from inside. The two units that were never located, he said. The fleet. One confirmed clean in Phoenix, the other… She paused. I got a call this morning. The customer is out of the hospital. The chair was inspected yesterday by a home visit team. Level 1, collar defect present but no measurable bracket wear, fixed on site. He exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding something until he let it go. That's all 217. That's all 217. He looked out at the field, at the assessment stations, and the people at them in Priya Sandhu at the demonstration table, explaining something to a small group with the intense focus of an engineer who had rebuilt her process from the ground up and needed people to understand why it was different now. At Renata Cruz at this feedback station, reviewing responses with the methodical seriousness of someone who understood that data only meant something if you used it. At Gerald, still visible at the far edge of the field, talking to another attendee and gesturing at the report Mason had given him. What do you think your father would make of all this? Aurora asked. The question was quiet and direct, the way her questions always were. He thought about it honestly. About his father bent over the workbench writing up estimates in careful block print. About the 22 years in that garage. About the way his father had run the shop. Not expansively, not ambitiously, but with the specific integrity of someone who believed that if you did the work right and treated people fairly, that was sufficient. That was enough. He'd probably say I'm overcomplicating it, Mason said. He'd say I fixed a wheel in a park, and everything after that was just paying attention. Is he wrong? He thought about it. About the collar specification and the legal pad and the conference room and 6 weeks of training sessions and 217 units and 120 people at a park on a Saturday. No, he said. He's not wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been thinking about something. A long-term idea. A consultation program, ongoing, not project-based. An independent voice for mechanical integrity review built into the company's structure. Someone who isn't inside the organizational pressures that create receiving inspection gaps and service ticket dismissals. Someone outside the system who can look at what the system is actually producing. She paused. I'd want that to be you, if you want it to be. He looked at her. That's a significant thing to offer. It's a significant role. It would be structured around your availability. The garage isn't going anywhere, and it shouldn't. It's yours. The consultation would be a fixed number of days per month, enough to be meaningful, but not enough to displace what you've built. She said this carefully, like she'd already thought through the ways it could go wrong. I'm not trying to absorb you into something. I'm trying to build something that needs you specifically, your way of looking at things, your particular stubbornness about saying what you actually find. He looked out at the field, at the event he'd helped design, at the venue he'd helped choose, at the assessment forms he'd written in his own handwriting that technicians from 4 service regions were now using. He thought about his father again, about the 22 years, about the different kind of life that was available if you built rather than just survived, and about the long time it had taken him to understand that building and surviving were not opposites, that you could survive hard things in the service of building something, and the surviving was part of the building. I need to know one thing, he said. Ask it. When you find the next problem, and there will be one, in any organization of this size, there's always a next thing. Are you going to do this again, the same way? She looked at him steadily. You mean, am I going to recall 200 units when I could recall 60 and save the money? Yeah. She didn't hesitate. Yes, every time. He believed her. He'd believed her when she'd said it the first time in the conference room, looking at Tom Vickers across the table. He believed her now in a different way. The way you believed someone not because they'd said the right thing, but because you'd watched them, over months, do the right thing when it was expensive and inconvenient and publicly difficult. That was a different kind of knowing. Then yes, he said, I'd like that. Lily, who had been observing this entire conversation with the attentiveness she reserved for situations she understood were important without fully understanding why, looked between them. Are you going to keep working together? She asked. Yes, Aurora said. Lily considered this. Good, she said. Because you're both good at it, and it would be a waste not to. Mason looked at his daughter, at the number written on her hand, 3/100ths off the spec, at her mismatched shoes, one blue, one gray, which she was still doing, which he'd stopped fighting because he'd realized approximately 2 months ago that she did it deliberately, that she'd decided a long time ago that it was funny, and that she was right about it. She was frequently right about things. He was trying to stay current with it. "We should get ice cream," Lily said. "We always get ice cream at this park." "We've been to this park once before," Mason said, "and we got ice cream. So, we always get ice cream." She looked at Aurora. "Do you want to come?" Aurora looked at her, then at Mason, briefly, and his face was doing the thing it did sometimes where it said a thing that he hadn't said out loud. She looked back at Lily. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." They packed up the remaining assessment materials as the event wound down in the long light of the late afternoon. Priya's team broke down the demonstration station. Renata's team collected the feedback logs, 214 responses that would become the basis for an industry report that Aurora's company would publish the following year. The first systematic analysis of user service experience across multiple mobility equipment manufacturers, which would turn out to be used by 3 other companies in their internal quality reviews and by 2 consumer advocacy organizations as a benchmark document. Mason helped fold tables and carry equipment to the vehicles, because that was what needed doing, and he was present. Lily helped by carrying small items with enormous seriousness and reporting on their location to anyone who asked. When the field was clear, the 4 of them, Mason, Lily, Aurora, and Priya, who had been roped in by Lily's insistence that more people should get ice cream, walked the path toward the parking area and toward the general direction of Darby's on 5th Street. They walked along the same stretch of trail where Mason had first noticed the sound of something catching and releasing in a wheel assembly 8 months ago. He didn't point it out. He knew where they were. Aurora, walking beside him at an unhurried pace, knew where they were. Some things didn't need to be said because they were already fully understood. He thought about what his father would actually make of this afternoon, and he thought the honest answer was more complicated than what he told Aurora. His father had been a simpler man, in the best sense, a man who had found his lane and run in it faithfully for 22 years, and that faithfulness had been its own form of excellence. Mason had thought for a long time that the garage was the lane he was supposed to stay in. That ambition was something other people had, and his job was to maintain the thing he'd been given. He understood now that the garage was not a limit. It was a foundation, the thing you built from, not the thing you built inside. His father's integrity in the workmanship, his insistence on saying what he found and writing it down accurately, his stubbornness about taking shortcuts, all of that had traveled from his father's hands into Mason's, and from Mason's hands into 6 weeks of training sessions and 217 inspections and a park event on a Saturday in April that 214 people had been waiting for without knowing it existed. That was a kind of inheritance, not money, not property, not even a thriving business, just a way of being in the world that turned out to be worth something, worth enough to matter, at a scale his father probably never imagined and Mason still hadn't fully caught up with. Lily was walking between him and Aurora, holding Mason's left hand and apparently attempting to hold Aurora's right, which Aurora had allowed with an expression of quiet surprise that she hadn't tried to hide. Lily was telling them about the rabbit book, which they had finished last night. Everyone had been fine, as promised, and the ending had been satisfying in the specific way that good endings were satisfying, which was that it didn't resolve everything but resolved enough to feel true. "The dad rabbit," Lily said, "he made a lot of mistakes, but he kept trying to fix them." "That's usually how it goes," Mason said. "Is that a lesson?" He thought about it. "More like just what happens. You make mistakes. You keep trying to fix them." He paused. "The important thing is you don't stop trying." Lily thought about this for a moment. "And you need good tools," she said. He laughed. Aurora made the small sound she made, the one that wasn't quite a laugh, but was everything adjacent to it. "Yeah," Mason said, "and you need good tools." The trail opened up ahead of them, the October shadows long on the pavement, the river visible through the trees, the park going about its evening business of joggers and strollers, and people walking slow with their hands in their pockets in the last of the day's warmth. The same path they'd all been on before, going the same direction, different walk. That was the thing about paths. They didn't change. The ground under your feet was what it was. What changed was who was walking it with you, and what you were carrying, and whether the thing in your pocket was an eviction notice or just your keys. Mason had his keys. He kept walking,